Hey there, welcome to Brad Arrows. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these stories give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The heart monitor's rhythmic beeping filled the sterile hospital room like a clock counting down to an inevitable end. Rebecca Thornton squeezed her mother's frail hand, feeling the papery skin grow colder with each struggling breath. Rose Thornton, all 67 years of stubborn North Carolina steel, lay surrounded by more tubes and wires than Rebecca could count. Well, I'll be blessed if I haven't been the biggest fool east of the Blue Ridge Mountains, Rose whispered, her voice barely audible above the mechanical symphony keeping her alive. Her eyes, once sharp as winter frost, now clouded with morphine and regret, fixed on Rebecca's face with desperate intensity. Rebecca leaned closer, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Mama, don't talk like that. Save your strength." But Rose's grip tightened with surprising force. "That mark on your shoulder, honey child, the one I kept telling you to get checked." Her breathing hitched, and the monitor's rhythm faltered. "Lord, forgive me. I should have told you the truth years ago." The small raised spot on Rebecca's shoulder seemed to throb in response, as if awakened by her mother's words. She'd carried it for 8 years now, dismissing it as nothing more than a harmless skin tag, something that ran in the Thornton family like green eyes or a stubborn streak. Dr. Henderson appeared in the doorway, his face grave as winter stone. Behind his wire-rimmed glasses, his eyes held the kind of weight that comes from delivering news no family wants to hear. Rebecca had known him since childhood. He delivered her, treated her scraped knees, and guided the family through her father's sudden stroke 15 years ago. But she'd never seen him look this shaken. "Rebecca," he said softly, stepping into the room with the careful movements of a man walking through a minefield. "We need to discuss your mother's condition. The test results came back." Rose's hand spasmed in Rebecca's grip. "Tell her," she wheezed, each word a struggle. "Tell her what we found in my blood, what's been hiding in our family all these years." The room seemed to shrink around Rebecca. Outside the window, Mercy General's parking lot stretched under harsh fluorescent lights, but it might as well have been another planet. Everything felt surreal, like she was watching someone else's nightmare unfold. Dr. Henderson cleared his throat, consulting his clipboard with the reluctance of a man reading a death warrant. "Your mother's condition isn't what we initially thought. It's not cancer, Rebecca. It's something else entirely. Something genetic that's been dormant in your bloodline." "Genetic?" Rebecca's voice cracked. The mark on her shoulder suddenly felt like it was burning, though she knew that was impossible. "What kind of genetic condition?" Rose's eyes rolled toward her daughter, pupils dilated, but still fierce with maternal urgency. "The kind that kills, baby girl. The kind that's been picking off Thorntons for generations, and we've been too proud or too scared to admit it." The heart monitor's beeping began to slow, each tone stretching longer than the last. Rebecca felt the world tilting on its axis, everything she thought she knew about her family crumbling like old newspaper. "Mama, what are you talking about? What's been killing our family?" But Rose's eyes were already beginning to glaze over, that terrible peaceful look that comes when the body finally stops fighting. Her lips moved one last time, forming words that would haunt Rebecca for the rest of her life. "Check your shoulder." The monitor's steady rhythm dissolved into chaos. Alarms blared, nurses rushed in, Dr. Henderson barked orders. But Rebecca couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think past the ice-cold realization that her mother had been keeping a secret that might kill them both. As the medical team worked frantically over Rose's still form, Rebecca's hand instinctively went to the small mark on her shoulder. For the first time in 8 years, it felt different, alive, waiting. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice whispered that her mother's dying words weren't just a warning. They were a countdown to something far worse than she could possibly imagine. The memory hit Rebecca like a sucker punch as she sat in the hospital corridor, waiting for the funeral director. 8 years ago, fresh out of college with a business degree that felt as useful as a screen door on a submarine, she'd been moving into her first apartment, a cramped studio above Murphy's Hardware on Pine Street. The whole place smelled like sawdust and hope, and she'd never felt more independent in her life. It was during the worst thunderstorm Cedar Valley had seen in decades when she first heard the crying. Rain was coming down in sheets, turning the streets into rivers, and Rebecca was trying to wrestle her second hand couch through the narrow doorway when a pitiful mewing sound cut through the thunder. There, huddled in a soggy cardboard box next to the dumpster, was the scrawniest orange tabby kitten she'd ever laid eyes on. His fur was matted flat against his tiny body, and his amber eyes were crusted with infection. But something about the way he looked at her, like she was his last hope in the world, made her heart clench tight. "Well, aren't you just a sorry sight?" she'd murmured, scooping up the box despite the rain soaking through her college sweatshirt. The kitten couldn't have weighed more than a pound, all ribs and desperate purring. She'd called her mother from the kitchen floor, the kitten wrapped in her good towels while she tried to coax him to drink some warm milk. "Mama, he's just a little thing, all skin and bones," Rebecca had said, watching the kitten's pink tongue lap weakly at the saucer. "I think somebody just dumped him here to die." Rose's voice had crackled through the old phone with that particular brand of maternal concern that always made Rebecca feel 12 years old again. "Honey child, you don't know where that critter's been. Could be carrying Lord knows what diseases, parasites, all manner of nastiness. You bring that thing to the vet first thing tomorrow. You hear me?" But Rebecca was already enchanted, watching the kitten's eyes brighten as he managed to keep the milk down. "Sometimes you got to trust your heart, not your head, Mama. Besides, look at him. He's already getting stronger." She'd named him Ryder for the way he rode on her shoulder as she walked around the apartment. Rose had plenty of other suggestions, most of them involving words like trouble and mistake. Within a week, he transformed from a half-dead scrap of fur into a playful ball of energy who followed Rebecca around the apartment like a tiny shadow. It was exactly 1 week after finding Ryder that Rebecca first noticed the mark. She'd been getting dressed for her first day at Henderson Insurance, the only job she could find that didn't require years of experience she didn't have. When her fingers brushed against a small raised spot on her right shoulder, about the size of a pea, perfectly round and tender to the touch. Stress, she told herself, adjusting her blouse to hide it. Just a stress bump from job hunting and living on ramen noodles. But even then, something had felt off about it. The mark was warm, warmer than the surrounding skin, and sometimes usually late at night when she was trying to fall asleep. It seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, like a second heartbeat. Ryder had taken an immediate and intense interest in that spot. He'd curl up against her shoulder every night, purring so hard his whole body vibrated. Sometimes, she'd wake to find him gently licking the area around the mark. When she tried to move him, he'd dig his claws in just enough to make her let him stay, as if he was guarding something precious. "That cat's got a sixth sense about you," Rose had observed during one of her weekly visits, watching Ryder assume his protective position. "Animals know things we don't. Maybe he's trying to tell you something." But Rebecca had been 21 and invincible, convinced that whatever the mark was, it would go away on its own. She had bigger things to worry about, like making rent and learning how to be a functioning adult. The mark was just another minor inconvenience in a life full of them. Looking back now, sitting in the hospital where her mother had just died from complications of what Dr. Henderson called a hereditary condition, Rebecca wondered if Ryder had been trying to warn her all along. The way he'd fixate on that spot, the way he'd sometimes stare at her with those knowing amber eyes, like he could see something she couldn't. The mark had stayed exactly the same size for 8 years, until 3 months ago when Rose's health started declining rapidly. That's when it began to change. First, it got slightly larger. Then it started itching at the most inconvenient times. During important meetings at work, in the middle of the night, while she was driving. Always that maddening itch that no amount of scratching could relieve. Rebecca had finally scheduled an appointment with Dr. Sullivan, a dermatologist in the next town over. But then Rose's condition worsened, and medical appointments for a cosmetic issue seemed selfish when her mother was dying. Now, as she sat in the hospital corridor with the taste of grief bitter in her mouth, Rebecca realized that her mother's final words weren't random morphine-induced rambling. Rose had been trying to tell her something crucial about that mark, something that connected to whatever genetic condition had killed her. The irony wasn't lost on Rebecca that she'd rescued Ryder on the same week the mark appeared. What were the odds of that timing? And why had Rose always been so suspicious of the cat, even after he'd proven himself to be the most gentle, loving pet Rebecca had ever owned? She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found Dr. Sullivan's office number. It was nearly midnight, but she left a voicemail anyway, her voice steady despite the storm raging in her chest. "Dr. Sullivan, this is Rebecca Thornton. I had an appointment scheduled for next week about a skin condition, but I need to move it up. It's urgent now. My mother just passed away from what the doctors are calling a genetic condition, and she specifically mentioned my shoulder mark before she died. I think they might be connected somehow. Please call me back as soon as possible." As she hung up, Rebecca caught her reflection in the dark window across the hall. 29 years old, hollow-eyed with grief, and carrying a mystery on her shoulder that might hold the key to understanding why her mother was dead. For the first time in 8 years, she was genuinely afraid of that little mark. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she could hear Rose's voice. "Honey child, you don't know where that critter's been." Maybe it was time to find out. The grandfather clock in Rose's hallway chimed 6 times as Rebecca pushed open the door to her childhood bedroom. The funeral home had been efficient, too efficient, whisking her mother's body away like she was nothing more than paperwork to be filed. Now the house felt hollow, echoing with 30 years of memories and the weight of unanswered questions. Rebecca's old room looked exactly as she'd left it at 18, frozen in time like a museum exhibit of teenage dreams. Pink floral wallpaper, now faded, covered walls lined with participation ribbons from high school track meets, and a bookshelf crammed with romance novels she'd been too embarrassed to take to college. But it wasn't nostalgia that brought her here. It was the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, where Rose kept all the family documents. Her hands shook as she lifted the heavy lid, releasing the scent of mothballs and old paper. Insurance policies, birth certificates, her father's military discharge papers, all the official documentation of a family's existence, neatly organized in manila folders, with Rose's precise handwriting on each tab. But there, wedged behind the Christmas decorations, was a folder Rebecca had never seen before. No label, just a thick manila envelope sealed with tape that had yellowed with age. Her mother's handwriting across the front read, "For Rebecca when I'm gone." Why didn't I listen? Rebecca whispered to the empty room, her voice cracking. Why was I so damn stubborn about everything? She could hear her mother's voice echoing through the years. Get that mark looked at, honey. It ain't natural. But Rebecca had always brushed off Rose's concerns as motherly paranoia, the same way she dismissed warnings about driving too fast or staying out too late. Now those ignored warnings felt like nails in a coffin she'd helped build. The tape tore with a sound like ripping fabric, and Rebecca's breath caught as she saw what was inside. Medical records dating back decades. Not just Rose's, but her grandfather's, her great-uncles, even some cousins she barely remembered. All of them had died young, all from what the death certificates vaguely listed as complications from chronic illness or unknown systemic infection. Her grandfather, Robert Thornton, had died at 34. The death certificate said farming accident, but clipped to it was a hospital record from 1987 describing unusual subcutaneous growth and parasitic inflammation of unknown origin. He'd been sick for months before the so-called accident, growing weaker and more confused, until one day they found him collapsed in the barn. Great-Uncle Jim had lasted until 41, but his medical records painted a picture of slow decline, punctuated by mysterious symptoms. Skin lesions that wouldn't heal, chronic fatigue, periods of delirium. The doctors had called it everything from chronic fatigue syndrome to early onset dementia, but none of their treatments had worked. And then there were the photos. Rebecca's stomach clenched as she flipped through a collection of old Polaroids, each showing a different family member with unmistakable raised marks on their shoulders, arms, or necks. The marks varied in size, but they all had the same characteristic appearance. Smooth, rounded, and sitting just beneath the skin like buried secrets. Her father wasn't in any of the photos. John Thornton had been an outsider who married into the family, never developing the mysterious marks that seemed to plague every blood relative. He died of a stroke at 52, sudden and brutal, but mercifully normal compared to the slow deterioration that had claimed the others. At the bottom of the envelope was a letter in Rose's handwriting, dated just 6 months ago. My dearest Rebecca, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you're finally ready to face the truth. I should have told you years ago. The mark on your shoulder isn't just some family trait or genetic quirk. It's something else entirely. something that's been killing Thornton men and women for as long as anyone can remember. I've spent years trying to understand what this is, visiting specialists in Raleigh and Charlotte, even driving all the way to Duke Medical Center in Durham. Most doctors don't know what to make of it, but I finally found one who recognized the symptoms. Dr. Alina Winters in Asheville specializes in rare parasitic conditions, and she's the only one who didn't look at me like I was crazy when I described our family's history. The thing is, honey, I think it has something to do with animals, specifically cats. Every single family member who developed these marks had close contact with stray or feral cats at some point before they got sick. Your grandfather was always feeding the barn cats. Uncle Jim rescued every stray tom that wandered onto his property. And your cousin Michael had been volunteering at the animal shelter before he passed. I tried to warn you about that orange cat you found, but you were so determined to save the poor thing. By the time you brought Ryder home, I could see you were already getting attached, and I didn't have the heart to make you give him up. Maybe I should have been stronger. Maybe I should have told you the truth then. But Rebecca, sweetheart, there might still be time. Dr. Winters thinks early intervention can make all the difference. Don't wait like I did. Don't spend years pretending everything is fine when you know in your heart something's wrong. The letter ended there, but paperclipped to it was a business card for Dr. Alina Winters, along with appointment dates going back 3 years. Rose had been seeing the specialist regularly, trying treatments that weren't covered by insurance, spending money they didn't have on tests and medications that ultimately hadn't saved her life. Rebecca sank onto her childhood bed, the medical records scattered around her like evidence at a crime scene. Every symptom Rose had experienced in her final months, the fatigue, the confusion, the strange skin lesions that wouldn't heal. It was all documented in these older family records. The same pattern repeated generation after generation, like a curse passed down through blood and bad luck. She knew, Rebecca said aloud, and the sound of her own voice in the empty house made her shiver. She knew she was dying, and she was trying to save me. The mark on her shoulder suddenly felt hot, like a coal pressed against her skin. She reached back to touch it and gasped. It was definitely larger than it had been even a week ago, and the skin around it felt tender and inflamed. For the first time, she noticed tiny red lines radiating outward from the mark, like some kind of infection spreading through her system. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and she grabbed it with desperate hope. Dr. Sullivan's office, responding to her voicemail. Miss Thornton, Dr. Sullivan can see you tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Please bring any family medical history you have available. This is urgent. Rebecca looked around at the scattered papers, the photos of dead relatives, the evidence of a family secret that had cost so many lives. She thought about Ryder, probably worried sick at her apartment, waiting for her to come home. 8 years they'd been together. 8 years of him sleeping curled against that mark on her shoulder, purring like his life depended on it. Had he been trying to comfort her, or had he been feeding off whatever was growing beneath her skin? The question made her stomach turn, but she forced herself to gather up all the medical records, all the photos, every piece of evidence Rose had collected. Tomorrow morning, she would finally get answers. Tonight, she would go home to a cat who might be either her salvation or her doom, and try to sleep knowing that time was running out faster than she'd ever imagined. As she locked up the house and drove back toward town, Rebecca caught herself checking the rearview mirror, as if she could see death itself following close behind. The smell of cornbread and pot roast filled Rose's kitchen 6 months ago, back when Sunday dinners were still a sacred tradition in the Thornton household. Rebecca could still see her mother standing at the old gas stove, humming along to the gospel station, while she stirred gravy with one hand and checked the oven with the other. It was the kind of domestic ballet Rose had perfected over decades, moving through her kitchen with the confidence of a woman who knew exactly where everything belonged. "Rebecca, honey, would you set the table?" Rose had called over her shoulder, not bothering to look up from her stirring. "And use the good china. Gabrielle's bringing that new boyfriend of hers, and I want to make a proper impression." Rebecca had rolled her eyes but complied, pulling out the blue willow plates that only came out for special occasions. Her sister Gabrielle was notorious for dating men who wouldn't last through football season, but Rose always treated each new suitor like potential son-in-law material. It was one of her more endearing qualities, that stubborn optimism about love and family. "Mama, you don't have to pull out all the stops for Kevin," Rebecca had said, arranging the silverware with the precision Rose had drilled into her as a child. "He's just some guy she met at the hardware store. Every guest in this house deserves respect," Rose had replied in that tone that brooked no argument. "Besides, you never know when someone might turn out to be important." The irony of those words now felt like a knife twist in Rebecca's chest. If only she'd known how important that particular Sunday would become, not because of Gabrielle's forgettable boyfriend, but because it was the first time Rose showed signs of the illness that would kill her. Gabrielle had arrived fashionably late, as always, with Kevin in tow. A lanky mechanic with calloused hands and an easy smile, he'd won Rose over immediately by complimenting her garden and asking for her cornbread recipe, though Rebecca suspected he was just being polite. Gabrielle had that effect on men, making them want to please her family, even when they had no intention of sticking around. They'd all been seated around the oak dining table that had belonged to Rebecca's grandmother, passing dishes and catching up on small-town gossip, when Rose suddenly went rigid in her chair. The gravy boat slipped from her hands, shattering against the hardwood floor in an explosion of brown liquid and ceramic shards. "Mama," Rebecca had jumped up, but Rose was already swaying, her face gone pale as milk. She gripped the table edge with white knuckles, her breathing shallow and rapid. "It's nothing," Rose had gasped, even as beads of sweat appeared on her forehead. "Just a dizzy spell. Happens when you get to be my age." But Rebecca had seen the fear in her mother's eyes, the way Rose's free hand had gone instinctively to her neck, where a mark identical to Rebecca's sat just below her collarbone. The gesture was so quick, so automatic, that Rebecca almost missed it. "Mama, you need to see Dr. Henderson," Rebecca said, moving to her mother's side. "This ain't normal. You don't just collapse for no reason." Gabrielle had been on her feet too, her face creased with worry that made her look older than her 32 years. "Rebecca's right. When's the last time you had a checkup?" But Rose had waved them both off with the stubborn determination that had carried her through decades of single motherhood after their father's death. "Don't you go worrying about your old mother. I've been handling myself just fine for 67 years, and I intend to keep doing it." Kevin had quietly cleaned up the broken gravy boat, while the Thornton women faced off in the familiar battle of wills that had defined their family dynamics for as long as Rebecca could remember. Rose, iron-willed and prideful, versus her daughters, equally stubborn but motivated by love and fear. "At least let me drive you to the urgent care clinic," Rebecca had pleaded, "just to make sure it's nothing serious." "I said I'm fine," Rose had snapped, but her voice lacked its usual authority. She'd managed to stand, but Rebecca noticed she kept one hand on the table for support. "Now somebody help me get dessert on the table before that apple pie gets cold." The rest of the meal had passed in uncomfortable tension, with Rose insisting on normal conversation, while Rebecca and Gabrielle exchanged worried glances. Kevin had done his best to lighten the mood with stories from the garage, but even he seemed to sense the undercurrent of family drama that had nothing to do with him. It was after dessert, when Gabrielle and Kevin were saying their goodbyes, that Rebecca noticed the change in Rose's mark. Her mother was hugging Gabrielle at the front door, and the porch light caught the area around her collarbone in stark relief. What had once been a small, barely noticeable raised spot now appeared swollen and angry, the skin around it red and inflamed. Rebecca had felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the October evening air. Her own mark had been acting up lately too, itching at random times, feeling warmer than the surrounding skin. She'd attributed it to stress from work, but seeing Rose's condition made her wonder if there was something more sinister at play. "Gabrielle, hold on a minute," Rebecca had called out, stopping her sister before she could leave. "We need to talk about Mama, all of us." Gabrielle had sent Kevin on ahead with promises to call him later, and the three women had returned to the kitchen, where Rose finally allowed herself to sink into a chair. The collapse seemed to have taken more out of her than she wanted to admit, and for the first time in Rebecca's memory, her mother looked genuinely frail. "Girls, I appreciate your concern, but I don't need you hovering over me like I'm some invalid," Rose had said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Mama, something's wrong," Gabrielle had said, pulling up a chair beside her. "That wasn't just a dizzy spell. You nearly fainted." Rebecca had taken the opportunity to really look at her mother. Not just the surface-level check-in she usually did during their weekly phone calls, but a thorough examination of the woman who had raised her. Rose's skin had a grayish undertone that Rebecca hadn't noticed before, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and hidden pain. "How long have you been feeling poorly?" Rebecca had asked, settling into the chair across from her mother. "And don't lie to us. We can see you're not yourself." Rose had been quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently tracing the edge of the tablecloth. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Maybe a few months. Nothing dramatic at first, just tired more than usual, some aches and pains. I figured it was just getting older, but it's gotten worse." Gabrielle had pressed gently, and Rose had admitted that the dizziness started about 3 weeks ago. "And I've been having these episodes where I can't quite remember what I was doing, or I'll find myself in a room with no idea why I went there." Rebecca's blood had run cold. Those were the same symptoms described in the medical records she would later find in Rose's cedar chest. The confusion, the memory lapses, the gradual decline that had claimed so many Thornton family members over the years. "Mama, you have to see a doctor," Rebecca had said, reaching across the table to take her mother's hand. "Whatever this is, ignoring it won't make it go away. But Rose had pulled her hand free, that familiar stubborn set returning to her jaw. I'm not spending my savings on some doctor who's just going to tell me I'm getting old. Money's tight enough as it is. Then I'll pay for it, Rebecca had said immediately. Gabrielle had nodded agreement. We both will, Mama. You can't put a price on your health. Looking back now, Rebecca realized that was the moment when everything started to unravel. Rose had eventually agreed to see Dr. Henderson, but only after weeks of pressure from both daughters. By then, whatever was wrong with her had progressed beyond the point of simple intervention. The visits to specialists had followed expensive consultations that insurance wouldn't cover, experimental treatments that offered hope but delivered disappointment. Rebecca had watched her mother fade a little more each week, the vibrant woman who had raised 2 daughters alone, becoming a shadow of her former self. And through it all, Rose had kept her secrets, carrying the weight of family history and medical mystery until her dying breath. The digital clock on a leaner winter's waiting room wall read 7:42 a.m. And Rebecca had been sitting in the same uncomfortable chair for 20 minutes, clutching a manila folder thick with her family's medical secrets. The office smelled like disinfectant and anxiety, a combination that made her stomach churn with each passing minute. Through the window, she could see the morning commute beginning in Asheville. Normal people heading to normal jobs, blissfully unaware that somewhere in their midst sat a woman who might be carrying the same curse that had killed her mother. Her phone buzzed with a text from her boss at Henderson Insurance. Taking another day. We need to discuss your attendance. Rebecca stared at the message, wondering how to explain that she couldn't focus on liability claims and policy renewals when she might be dying from some mysterious family condition. She'd already burned through most of her sick days caring for Rose, and now her job was hanging by a thread thinner than her hope for good news. Miss Thornton, a nurse, appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. Dr. Winters will see you now. The examination room was smaller than Rebecca had expected, decorated with cheerful prints of wildflowers that did nothing to calm her racing heart. Dr. Winters entered moments later, a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen enough medical mysteries to surprise very little. I'm sorry for your loss, Dr. Winters said, settling into her chair and opening a thick file. Your mother was a remarkable woman. She fought harder than most patients I've treated. Rebecca's throat tightened. You treated my mother. She never mentioned your name until the end. I imagine Rose was very private about her condition. She didn't want to worry you girls until she understood what we were dealing with. Dr. Winters pulled out a series of photographs that made Rebecca's blood freeze. These are microscopic images from tissue samples we took during her treatment. 3 months ago, while Rebecca had been arguing with insurance companies and trying to manage her mother's medications, Rose had been undergoing secret medical procedures. The photographs showed what looked like tiny worms or parasites embedded in muscle tissue, their segmented bodies clearly visible under high magnification. What am I looking at? Rebecca whispered, though part of her already knew the answer would change everything. Toxicera catty larvae, Dr. Winters said matter-of-factly. A parasitic roundworm typically found in cats. What makes your mother's case unusual is the location and duration of the infestation. These organisms had been living in her system for decades, slowly forming cysts and causing chronic inflammation. Rebecca's hand flew to the mark on her shoulder, which had been throbbing with increasing intensity all morning. Is it contagious? Not directly from person to person, no. But it can be transmitted through contact with infected animals, particularly cats who haven't been properly dewormed. Dr. Winters leaned forward, her expression growing more serious. Rebecca, I need you to tell me about any cats you've had contact with, especially as a child or young adult. The room seemed to spin as Rebecca thought about Ryder, curled up at home and probably wondering why she hadn't come back last night. 8 years of sleeping together, of him licking that exact spot on her shoulder, of him purring against the mark like it was some kind of beacon calling to him. I have a cat, Rebecca said slowly. Ryder. I found him as a stray kitten about 8 years ago, right around the time my mark first appeared. Dr. Winters made notes in her file, nodding as if this confirmed her suspicions. Has the mark changed recently? Grown larger, become more sensitive? In the last few months, yes. It itches constantly now, and sometimes it feels like it's burning. Rebecca pulled up her sleeve to show the doctor, who immediately moved closer for examination. Under the bright examination light, the mark looked angrier than Rebecca had realized. What had once been a smooth, pea-sized raised area was now roughly the size of a quarter, with visible red streaks radiating outward under her skin. Dr. Winters palpated the area gently, and Rebecca winced at the unexpected tenderness. We need to schedule you for immediate testing, Winters said, returning to her desk to pull out requisition forms. Blood work, tissue biopsy, and a full body scan to check for additional cysts. Additional cysts? Rebecca's voice came out as a squeak. In advanced cases, the larvae can migrate throughout the body, forming cysts in various organs and muscle groups. Your mother had 17 separate cysts when we first examined her. Dr. Winters' pen scratched across the forms with urgent efficiency. The good news is that, caught early, this condition is very treatable. The bad news is that we're working against time. Present-day reality crashed back into Rebecca's consciousness like a freight train. While she'd been lost in memories and medical revelations, her phone had been buzzing insistently. Missed calls from Gabrielle, from her boss, from the funeral home about arrangements she'd completely forgotten to finalize. How much time? Rebecca asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Based on your symptoms and family history, I'd estimate we have a window of about 48 hours before the condition progresses to the point where treatment becomes significantly more complicated. Winters handed her the stack of lab orders. I've marked these as urgent priority. We'll have preliminary results by this afternoon. Rebecca's phone rang again, Gabrielle's ringtone. She declined the call but immediately received a text. Where are you? Funeral home called. They need decisions today about the service. The weight of everything crashed down on her at once. Her mother was dead. She was potentially dying from the same condition. Her job was in jeopardy. Funeral arrangements were pending. And somewhere in all of this chaos was a cat who might be either innocent victim or unwitting accomplice in her family's destruction. Doctor, I need to ask you something, Rebecca said, her voice steadier than she felt. My cat, Ryder, is he in danger too? Could this thing kill him? Dr. Winters' expression softened slightly. Cats are the natural host for this parasite. He's probably been carrying it his entire life without serious symptoms. But he'll need treatment too, both for his own health and to prevent reinfection. Rebecca thought about the past 3 months, watching her mother deteriorate while her own symptoms worsened. The sleepless nights when Ryder would purr against her shoulder for hours, the way he'd become increasingly clingy and protective. Had he sensed what was happening to her? Had he been trying to comfort her? Or had his presence somehow accelerated her condition? "I have to go," Rebecca said abruptly, gathering her purse and the lab orders. "My sister's been trying to reach me about funeral arrangements, and I still have to." "Rebecca," Dr. Winter's voice stopped her at the door. "I know this is overwhelming, but you cannot delay these tests. Your mother waited too long, and by the time she came to me, the damage was too extensive to reverse completely. You still have a chance." The drive back to Cedar Valley passed in a blur of mountain curves and small town storefronts that had looked exactly the same for decades. Rebecca's phone continued buzzing with calls and texts. Gabrielle growing increasingly frantic about funeral decisions. Her boss's messages becoming less sympathetic and more threatening. Reminders about bills and responsibilities that seemed impossibly trivial compared to the biological time bomb ticking away inside her body. She pulled into her apartment complex just as the lab in Asheville opened for morning appointments. 46 hours and counting until her window of effective treatment began to close. 46 hours to bury her mother, save her own life, make peace with her sister, and somehow find a way to forgive a cat who had been both her closest companion and potentially her unwitting executioner. Ryder was waiting by the door when she walked in, his amber eyes bright with concern and his purr already rumbling in anticipation of their reunion. For 8 years, he'd been her constant companion, her comfort during lonely nights and stressful days. Now, as he wound around her legs and gazed up at her with unconditional love, Rebecca wondered if she was looking at her salvation or her doom. The microscope images spread across Winter's desk looked like something from a nightmare. Rebecca stared at the black and white photographs, trying to make sense of what she was seeing while her world tilted on its axis. The segmented, worm-like creatures embedded in what Dr. Winters had identified as her tissue samples were clearly visible, their alien forms magnified to horrifying clarity. "Miss Thornton, I need you to understand something very important," Dr. Winters said, her voice carrying the weight of a woman who had delivered life-changing news to countless patients. "What we're looking at isn't just any parasitic infection. These organisms represent a strain of Toxocara cati that we've never documented before." Rebecca's mouth went dry. "What do you mean, never documented?" Dr. Winters pulled out a thick medical journal and flipped to a page marked with yellow sticky notes. "Standard Toxocara infections in humans are relatively rare and usually resolve within months, sometimes years. But this strain appears to have adapted specifically to human hosts over multiple generations. The larvae don't just migrate through the body randomly. They establish permanent colonies in specific locations, particularly areas with rich blood supply." The mark on Rebecca's shoulder suddenly felt like it was on fire. She pressed her hand against it, feeling the heat radiating through her shirt. "You're saying this thing has been evolving inside my family." "That's exactly what I'm saying." Dr. Winter's expression was grave, as she pulled out another set of documents. "I've been researching your family's medical history since your mother first came to see me 3 years ago. What I've discovered challenges everything we thought we knew about host-parasite relationships." The folder Dr. Winters opened contained copies of death certificates, medical records, and what appeared to be correspondence with other medical professionals. Rebecca recognized some of the names. Her grandfather, great-uncle Jim, cousins she barely remembered. But there were others she'd never heard of, Thornton relatives stretching back generations. "Your family has been dealing with this condition for over a century," Winters continued. "But here's what's truly unprecedented. The parasite appears to have developed a symbiotic relationship with its human hosts. In early stages, it actually strengthens the immune system, making carriers more resistant to other infections and diseases." Rebecca felt like she was drowning in information that made no medical sense. "If it strengthens the immune system, why did it kill my mother? Why is it killing everyone?" Dr. Winters' face darkened. "Because eventually, the colony reaches a critical mass. The organisms begin reproducing at an accelerated rate, and the human body can't support the increased metabolic demands. The host essentially burns out from the inside." The implications hit Rebecca like a physical blow. "How long do I have? Based on your current symptoms and the progression we've observed in other family members, I estimate 18 to 24 months before you reach the critical stage." Dr. Winters leaned forward, her eyes intense. "But Rebecca, there's something else you need to know. Something that changes everything we thought about how this infection spreads." Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs. "What?" "The cats aren't the original source. They're secondary hosts, just like you." Dr. Winters pulled out a map of North Carolina with red pins marking various locations. "I've been tracking similar cases across the Southeast for the past 5 years. Every single infection can be traced back to a specific geographic area, a region that includes your family's ancestral land." The map showed a cluster of red pins centered around Cedar Valley and the surrounding rural counties. Rebecca recognized the area immediately. It was where her great-great-grandfather had first settled in the 1890s, where generations of Thorntons had farmed the same red clay soil. "The parasite is endemic to that region," Dr. Winters explained. "It's been in the soil, the water, the local ecosystem for possibly centuries. Your ancestors didn't just happen to get infected. They settled in an area where this organism was already established and waiting." Rebecca stared at the map, trying to process what she was hearing. "So everyone who lives there is at risk?" "Not everyone. The parasite appears to be highly selective about its human hosts. It requires specific genetic markers that seem to run in certain bloodlines." Winters pointed to a genetic analysis chart that meant nothing to Rebecca. "Your family carries a rare combination of genetic factors that make you ideal hosts for this particular strain." The room seemed to spin around Rebecca as the full horror of her situation became clear. "We're not just infected, we're bred for this." "In a sense, yes. Over generations, the parasite has been selecting for the genetic traits that make it most successful. Your family's longevity, your resistance to common diseases, even certain physical characteristics, they've all been influenced by this symbiotic relationship." Rebecca thought about her family's history, the way Thorntons had always been known for their strength and resilience. Her grandfather had worked his farm well into his 60s despite his illness. Her mother had raised 2 daughters alone after her husband's death, never missing a day of work until the final months of her life. But if it's been helping us survive, why does it eventually kill us? Dr. Winter's expression grew even more serious. Because it's not just using you as a host, it's using you as a breeding ground. When the colony reaches maturity, it needs to reproduce and spread to new hosts. The process is invariably fatal to the original carrier. The implications were staggering. Rebecca's entire family line, everyone she'd ever loved, had been nothing more than elaborate incubators for an ancient parasite that had been manipulating their genetics for over a century. "There's more," Dr. Winters said quietly. "The cats don't just carry the parasite randomly. They're drawn to infected humans by pheromones released by the colony. Ryder didn't find you by accident. He was literally called to you by the organisms already in your system." Rebecca felt like she might vomit. 8 years of loving a pet who had been nothing more than a biological homing device, drawn to her by the very thing that was slowly killing her. "Dr. Winters," Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper, "is there any way to stop this? Any treatment that actually works?" The doctor was quiet for a long moment, studying Rebecca's face, as if weighing how much truth she could handle. "There are experimental treatments, aggressive antiparasitic protocols combined with immune system modulators. The success rate is limited." "How limited?" "In advanced cases like your mother's, we've seen a 5% survival rate. But caught early, with aggressive intervention, we might achieve 30 to 40% success." Rebecca closed her eyes, trying to process the mathematics of her own mortality. Even with treatment, the odds were stacked heavily against her survival. And that was assuming she could afford the experimental treatments that insurance would never cover. "There's one more thing you need to know," Dr. Winters said. "This condition appears to be accelerating. Each generation develops symptoms earlier and progresses faster than the last. Your mother lived 67 years before reaching the critical stage. Based on what we're seeing, you might have significantly less time." The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Not only was she dying from the same condition that had killed her mother, but she was dying faster than any previous generation. As she sat in the sterile examination room, surrounded by the medical evidence of her family's cursed biology, Rebecca realized that everything she thought she knew about her life had been a lie, constructed around the needs of an ancient parasite that had been pulling the strings of her bloodline for over a century. Rebecca's hands trembled as she turned the key to her mother's house at 11:47 p.m., 3 days after the devastating meeting with Dr. Winters. Sleep had become impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those microscopic photographs, the segmented parasites that had been feeding off her family for generations. The mark on her shoulder had grown noticeably larger, and the itching had evolved into something that felt like tiny teeth gnawing at her from the inside. The house felt different in the darkness, filled with shadows that seemed to move independently of her flashlight beam. She'd come here looking for answers, hoping Rose's hidden papers might contain some clue about treatment options Dr. Winters hadn't mentioned. But as she made her way to her mother's bedroom, Rebecca felt like she was walking into a tomb filled with secrets that were better left buried. Rose's diary sat in the bottom drawer of her nightstand, beneath a stack of church bulletins and grocery store coupons. Rebecca had seen her mother writing in it countless times over the years, always assuming it was just daily observations about weather and garden progress. The leather cover was worn smooth from decades of handling, and when Rebecca opened it, the pages released the faint scent of Rose's lavender hand lotion. The early entries were mundane. Notes about canning vegetables, reminders for doctor's appointments, observations about neighbors and their small-town dramas. But as Rebecca flipped toward the more recent pages, the tone changed dramatically. Her mother's neat handwriting became increasingly erratic, and the content grew darker with each entry. March 15th, Rebecca brought that orange cat home today. I tried to warn her, but she won't listen. Maybe it's already too late. The thing on my neck is getting bigger, and I can feel it moving at night. God help me, I think it knows I'm watching it. Rebecca's blood went cold. Her mother had been aware of the parasite's activity for months, maybe years, and had never said a word. She flipped ahead, searching for more recent entries. June 3rd found Dr. Winter's research about controlled exposure therapy. The idea is to introduce the parasite at a young age when the immune system can still adapt. Maybe I was wrong to try to protect Rebecca. Maybe I should have let her get infected sooner, when she was stronger. The words made no sense. Rose had tried to warn Rebecca away from cats, had always been suspicious of Ryder. Why would she write about wanting Rebecca to get infected sooner? June 20th, spoke with Dr. Winters about Rebecca's condition. She says the mark appeared right on schedule, exactly when I hoped it would. The timing couldn't be more perfect. Rebecca was 21 when she found the cat, old enough for her immune system to be mature, young enough to adapt. I prayed every night that it would work. Rebecca's stomach lurched as the terrible truth began to dawn on her. She flipped frantically through the pages, looking for more entries, more explanations for what she was reading. July 8th, put the orange kitten in that cardboard box behind Rebecca's apartment building. Had to make sure it looked natural, like she was rescuing a stray. Winters says the younger cats carry the weaker strain of the parasite, better for initial exposure. Rebecca's always been soft-hearted about animals. I knew she'd take him in. The diary slipped from Rebecca's nerveless fingers, falling to the bedroom floor with a sound like thunder in the midnight silence. Her mother hadn't been trying to protect her from Ryder. Rose had deliberately placed the infected kitten where Rebecca would find him. The rescue that had defined Rebecca's relationship with her beloved pet had been a carefully orchestrated biological attack. July 15th, Rebecca called to tell me about the mark on her shoulder. Right where it should be, right on schedule. Dr. Winter's theory about controlled exposure might actually work. If Rebecca's body can adapt to the parasite while she's still young and healthy, she might survive what killed Dad and Grandpa and all the rest. Rebecca sank onto her mother's bed, her mind reeling with the implications. Rose hadn't been keeping secrets to protect Rebecca. She'd been conducting a medical experiment on her own daughter, using her as a test subject for an unproven theory about parasitic adaptation. August 2nd, the treatments Dr. Winters prescribed for me aren't working. The colony in my system is too established, too aggressive. But Rebecca's infection is progressing exactly as we hoped. Slow growth, minimal symptoms, strong immune response. Maybe she'll be the first Thornton to survive this thing. Rebecca grabbed the diary from the floor, flipping through pages with increasing desperation. Each entry revealed another layer of betrayal, another carefully calculated decision that had shaped Rebecca's entire adult life without her knowledge or consent. September 10th, Rebecca's been asking questions about the family medical history. I can't tell her the truth yet. She needs more time for the adaptation process to complete. Dr. Winters thinks another 6 months of controlled exposure before we begin treatment. Rebecca's always been stubborn. If she knew what we were doing, she'd fight the process and ruin everything. The bedroom walls seemed to close in around Rebecca as she realized the full scope of her mother's deception. Every conversation about getting the mark checked, every warning about Ryder, every expression of maternal concern had been performance art, designed to hide a medical experiment that treated Rebecca like a laboratory rat. October 1st, Rebecca brought Ryder to the vet for his annual checkup. I made sure Dr. Morrison knew not to deworm him too aggressively. We need him to maintain his carrier status for at least another few months. Rebecca would kill me if she knew I was interfering with her cat's medical care. But it's all for her own good. Rebecca's vision blurred with tears of rage and betrayal. Her mother had been manipulating not just her health, but Ryder's as well, ensuring that the infection would continue at the optimal rate for whatever twisted plan Dr. Winters had devised. November 15th. My symptoms are getting worse. The confusion episodes are happening almost daily now, and I can feel the things moving under my skin. But Rebecca's adaptation is proceeding beautifully. Her immune system has integrated with the parasite colony in ways we never thought possible. She might actually live through this. Rebecca threw the diary across the room, where it hit the wall and fell open to a page dated just 2 weeks before Rose's death. December 3rd, Rebecca's been experiencing increased symptoms: itching, inflammation, growth of the primary colony site. Dr. Winters says this is normal for the final stage of adaptation. If the process works, Rebecca's body will learn to control the parasite population, keeping it at sustainable levels indefinitely. If it doesn't work, she'll die like all the rest of us. But at least we tried something different. The final entry was dated December 10th, the day before Rose collapsed. I can't write much anymore. The confusion is too bad, but I need Rebecca to know that everything I did was out of love. I deliberately infected my own daughter with the thing that killed my father and his father before him. I turned her into a test subject for an experimental treatment that might not even work. But she was going to get infected anyway, sweetheart. It's inevitable for anyone with Thornton blood who stays in this area. At least this way, she had a chance. At least this way, someone who loves her was controlling the variables. I pray to God she'll forgive me when she learns the truth. I pray to God the treatment works, and she lives long enough to hate me for what I've done. Rebecca sat in the darkness of her mother's bedroom, surrounded by the wreckage of everything she'd believed about her family, her pet, and her own life. Rose hadn't been a victim of some ancient family curse. She'd been a willing participant in a medical experiment that used Rebecca as a human guinea pig. The worst part was the cold logic of it all. Rose had been right about one thing. Rebecca probably would have been infected eventually anyway. The Thornton genetic markers, the family land, the endemic parasite population, it was all stacked against her from birth. But instead of warning Rebecca about the danger, or helping her make an informed choice. Rose had taken control of the situation and manipulated every aspect of Rebecca's exposure to the parasite. As Rebecca sat in the midnight darkness, feeling the things under her skin moving with increasing agitation, she realized that her mother's final words at the hospital hadn't been a warning or a confession. They'd been an instruction manual for understanding the biological weapon Rose had spent 8 years crafting inside her daughter's body. And somewhere in Asheville, Dr. Winters was waiting to see if the experiment would succeed, or if Rebecca would become just another casualty in the Thornton family's century-long war against an enemy that lived in their own blood. Gabrielle's car pulled into the driveway at 6:30 a.m., gravel crunching under her tires as Rebecca watched from the kitchen window. Her sister looked haggard in the early morning light, her usually perfect hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her face creased with worry. Behind her, stepping out of the passenger side, was their Aunt Violet, Rose's older sister who lived 3 hours away in Charlotte and rarely visited, except for funerals and Christmas. Rebecca hadn't seen Violet in over 2 years, but the woman looked exactly the same. Steel gray hair in a practical bob, sensible shoes, and the kind of no-nonsense expression that suggested she'd driven through the night to deliver news that couldn't wait for a reasonable hour. "Rebecca, honey, we need to talk," Gabrielle called out as she climbed the front porch steps. "Aunt Violet has some things to tell us about Mama's condition." The 3 women settled around Rose's kitchen table, the same spot where Rebecca had discovered her mother's first symptoms 6 months ago. Violet's face was drawn with exhaustion, but her eyes held a clarity that reminded Rebecca uncomfortably of Rose in her final days. The look of someone carrying secrets too heavy for one person to bear. "I should have come forward sooner," Violet began, her voice rough from cigarettes and regret. "But Rose made me promise to wait until after she was gone. She was afraid you girls would try to stop the treatment if you knew the whole truth." Rebecca's stomach clenched. What treatment? What truth? Violet pulled out a folder from her purse, the same kind of manila envelope Rebecca had found in Rose's cedar chest. "Your mother wasn't just a victim of this family condition, Rebecca. She was working with Dr. Winters to try to break the cycle that's been killing Thornton men and women for generations." Gabrielle leaned forward, her face pale. "What are you talking about? What cycle?" "The parasitic infection that's been in our bloodline since your great-great-grandfather settled on that land outside town," Violet said matter-of-factly. "Rose figured it out about 10 years ago when she started tracing the family medical history. Every Thornton who stayed in this area eventually developed the same symptoms, the same decline, the same death." Rebecca felt like she was falling through space. You knew about the parasites." "I've known for 40 years, Violet said quietly. "I was the first one to get tested when Rose started her research. Turns out I've been carrying them my whole life too. But I moved away from Cedar Valley when I was 18. The change in environment, the different water and soil composition in Charlotte, it slowed down the parasite's development significantly." Violet opened her folder and pulled out medical records spanning decades. "I've been getting treated by specialists in Charlotte for 20 years. Low-dose antiparasitic medications, immune system boosters, regular monitoring. The parasites are still there, but they're dormant, controlled. I'm 70 years old, Rebecca, and I'm healthier than your mother was at 50. Gabrielle stared at their aunt in disbelief. Why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you warn Mama? I tried, Violet said, her voice breaking slightly. But Rose was convinced there had to be another way. She didn't want to uproot her whole life, leave the family land, abandon everything she'd built here. So she started working with Dr. Winters on what they called controlled exposure therapy. Rebecca's blood ran cold as she remembered the diary entries. The treatment where they deliberately infected me. Violet's face crumpled with guilt. Rose believed that if she could control the timing and dosage of your infection, your body might adapt differently than previous generations. You were supposed to develop immunity while the parasite colony was still small and manageable. But it didn't work, Rebecca said flatly. I'm still infected. I'm still going to die. Violet shook her head vigorously. No, honey, that's what I came to tell you. The treatment did work, just not the way Rose expected. She pulled out a sheet of laboratory results dated just 3 days ago. I've been in contact with Dr. Winters since Rose's death. The blood samples they took from you last week show something unprecedented. Your immune system hasn't just adapted to the parasite. It's learned to control its reproduction cycle. Rebecca stared at the medical jargon on the paper, trying to make sense of numbers and percentages that might mean the difference between life and death. What does that mean in English? It means the parasite colony in your system has reached a stable equilibrium, Violet explained. Instead of growing exponentially until it kills you, it's maintaining a steady population that your body can support indefinitely. You're not cured, Rebecca, but you're not dying either. Gabrielle grabbed Rebecca's hand across the table. Are you saying she's going to be okay? Violet's expression was cautious but hopeful. The early indicators are promising. Rebecca's white blood cell count is normal, her organ function is stable, and most importantly, the parasite population has plateaued at sustainable levels. Dr. Winters thinks she might be the first Thornton in over a century to achieve long-term survival with this condition. Rebecca felt like she was drowning in relief and confusion. But Mama died. If the treatment worked, why didn't it save her? Because Rose's infection was too advanced when she started the controlled exposure protocol, Violet said sadly. She'd been carrying the parasites for 67 years before she attempted treatment. Her body couldn't adapt the way yours did. But she knew that when she started the experiment. The terrible truth hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She sacrificed herself to save me. She sacrificed herself to try to save you, Violet corrected gently. There was no guarantee the treatment would work. Rose was gambling with both your lives, but she believed it was the only chance either of you had. Rebecca thought about her mother's final words, the desperate urgency in Rose's voice as she talked about the mark on Rebecca's shoulder. She hadn't been warning Rebecca about danger. She'd been trying to tell her that the danger had already passed, that the treatment had worked, that Rebecca was going to survive. There's more, Violet continued. Dr. Winters wants to study your case, document the successful adaptation process. If she can replicate what happened with you, she might be able to develop treatments for other families dealing with similar parasitic conditions. Gabrielle wiped tears from her eyes. So Rebecca's going to live. She's really going to be okay. She's going to need regular monitoring for the rest of her life, Violet said. Blood tests every 6 months, immune system support, careful attention to any changes in symptoms. But yes, all indications are that Rebecca will live a normal lifespan. Rebecca sat in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of what she was hearing. Her mother hadn't been conducting a cruel experiment. Rose had been throwing herself on a grenade to save her daughter's life. The controlled infection, the secrecy, the careful manipulation of Rebecca's exposure to the parasites through Ryder. It had all been part of a desperate gamble that had ultimately succeeded. Ryder, Rebecca said suddenly. What about Ryder? Is he okay? Violet smiled for the first time since arriving. Dr. Winters says cats are natural carriers. He's been living with the parasites his whole life without serious harm. With regular veterinary care and deworming, he should be fine. As the morning sun streamed through Rose's kitchen windows, Rebecca realized that her mother's greatest act of love had been disguised as betrayal. Rose had risked everything: her relationship with her daughter, her own moral compass, her life, to give Rebecca something no Thornton had possessed in over a century: a future. 6 months after Rose's funeral, Rebecca stood in her mother's kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, flour dusting her hands as she rolled out pie crust, just the way Rose had taught her 20 years ago. The familiar rhythm of the rolling pin against the wooden board brought back memories of countless Sunday dinners when this house had been filled with the warmth of family gatherings and the comfort of routine. The kitchen table was set for 8 people today: Gabrielle and her new boyfriend Marcus, Aunt Violet, who'd driven down from Charlotte, Dr. Winters and her husband, who'd become unexpected friends over the months of medical follow-ups, and 3 members of the support group Rebecca had started for families dealing with rare parasitic conditions. It wasn't a large group yet, but it was growing as word spread through medical networks across the Southeast. Ryder weaved between Rebecca's legs as she worked, his purr a steady rumble of contentment. The orange tabby showed no lasting effects from his years as an unknowing participant in Rose's medical experiment. Regular veterinary care and a proper deworming protocol had restored him to perfect health, though he remained as devoted to Rebecca as ever, still preferring to sleep curled against her shoulder where the mark had once been. The mark itself had shrunk to barely noticeable proportions over the past 6 months. Regular blood tests showed that the parasite colony in Rebecca's system had stabilized at levels her immune system could manage indefinitely. Dr. Winters called it a medical breakthrough, the first documented case of successful human adaptation to chronic Toxocara catty infection. Rebecca called it her mother's final gift. "Smells like heaven in here," Gabrielle called out as she entered through the back door, her arms laden with grocery bags. "Marcus brought wine, and I picked up those dinner rolls from Johnson's bakery that Mama always liked." Rebecca smiled, adding the last crimps to the pie crust edges. She'd have something to say about store-bought rolls, but I think she'd approve of the company. The past 6 months had brought Rebecca and Gabrielle closer than they'd been since childhood. The shared trauma of Rose's death and the revelation of their family's medical history had forced them to rely on each other in ways they hadn't since they were children. Gabrielle had moved back to Cedar Valley after her latest relationship ended, taking a job at the local bank and renting a small house just 3 blocks from Rebecca's apartment. More importantly, Gabrielle had tested negative for the Thornton genetic markers that made Rebecca susceptible to the parasite. As the product of their father's second marriage, after he had moved away from the family land, Gabrielle carried none of the bloodline vulnerabilities that had plagued generations of Thorntons. She would never develop the symptoms that had killed her stepmother and threatened her half-sister. "Rebecca, honey, you need to see this," Aunt Violet called from the living room, where she'd been looking through old photo albums with Dr. Winters. "I found something your mother wanted you to have." Rebecca wiped her hands on Rose's apron, the same one she'd watched her mother wear for decades, and joined the others in the living room. Violet was holding an envelope that looked newer than most of Rose's papers, with Rebecca's name written across the front in her mother's careful script. "I found this tucked inside the family Bible," Violet explained. "Rose asked me to make sure you got it after you'd had time to process everything else." Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered with Rose's handwriting, dated just 2 weeks before her death. "My dearest Rebecca, if you're reading this, then you know the truth about what I did to you, and I pray you can find it in your heart to forgive me. I know how it must look, like I used you as a test subject, like I gambled with your life for the sake of medical science. But I need you to understand that everything I did came from a place of desperate love. When I realized what was killing our family, I had 2 choices. I could watch you die the same way my father died, the way my grandfather died, the way I was going to die. Or I could try something different, something that might give you a chance at the life none of us ever had. The controlled exposure wasn't my idea originally. Dr. Winters had been researching it for years with other families, other bloodlines carrying similar genetic burdens. But you were the perfect candidate, young enough for your immune system to adapt, old enough to survive the initial infection, and most importantly, someone I could protect and monitor throughout the process. I won't lie to you. There were nights I couldn't sleep, wondering if I was killing my own daughter. Every time you complained about the itching, every time the mark grew larger, I questioned whether I was doing the right thing. But then I would remember holding my father's hand as he died, watching the same confusion and pain I was experiencing, and I knew I had to try. You were always the strong one, Rebecca. Even as a little girl, you had a resilience that reminded me of my grandmother, the only Thornton woman who lived past 50 before modern medicine gave us options our ancestors never had. I gambled that your strength would be enough to survive what I was putting you through. I need you to know that you were never just an experiment to me. You were my daughter, my heart walking around outside my body, the most precious thing in my world. Every decision I made was weighed against one simple question. What gives Rebecca the best chance to live and thrive, and have the family of her own that she deserves? The treatment worked, sweetheart. Dr. Winters' latest tests show that your body has achieved something medical science said was impossible. You're not cured. The parasites will always be part of you, but you're free. Free to live anywhere you want. Free to have children if you choose. Free to grow old in ways that no Thornton has been able to do for over a century. I hope someday you'll be able to look back on this and see it as I do, not as a betrayal, but as a mother's love expressed in the only way that could save her child's life. I hope you'll understand that sometimes the greatest act of love is doing something that looks terrible from the outside, but comes from a place of absolute devotion. Take care of Ryder for me. He was part of the treatment, but he was also your companion through all of this. He deserves a good life for the role he played in saving yours. And please don't blame Dr. Winters. She wanted to tell you the truth from the beginning, but I convinced her that the treatment would work better if you weren't stressed about the outcome. She's a good woman who agreed to help a desperate mother save her daughter. I love you more than words can express, and I'm proud of the woman you've become. Live the life I couldn't have, Rebecca. Make it count. All my love, Mama. Rebecca finished reading through tears, her heart full of complex emotions she couldn't quite name. Grief, gratitude, anger, and love all swirled together as she folded the letter carefully and looked around the room at the people who had become her chosen family. Well, I'll be blessed if my mama wasn't the smartest woman east of the Blue Ridge Mountains after all, Rebecca said, her voice thick with emotion, but steady with conviction. As the afternoon sun slanted through Rose's lace curtains, Rebecca realized that her mother's greatest achievement hadn't been breaking the Thornton family curse. It had been transforming it into something that looked like hope. The support group, the medical research, the possibility of helping other families facing similar genetic challenges. It was all part of Rose's legacy, her way of ensuring that her sacrifice would ripple outward to save lives beyond just her daughters. Rebecca returned to the kitchen to check on her apple pie, using Rose's recipe, but adding her own touches. Some traditions were worth preserving, while others needed to evolve, like the Thornton family itself. The recipe would continue, but it would be better, stronger, and sweeter than what had come before. Outside, the North Carolina sun shone down on land that had once been a trap for her ancestors, but would now be simply home, a place where Rebecca could choose to stay or leave, knowing that either decision came from freedom rather than fear. Sometimes the greatest acts of love come disguised as betrayal, and the hardest truths are the ones we discover after it's too late to say thank you. Rebecca's story reminds us that our parents carried burdens we never knew about, made impossible choices we couldn't understand, and sacrificed pieces of themselves to give us chances they never had. How many of us dismissed our mother's worries as paranoia, brushed off our father's concerns as outdated thinking, only to realize years later that they were trying to protect us from dangers we couldn't see. Rose Thornton gambled everything, her relationship with her daughter, her own moral compass, her life, to break a cycle of tragedy that had claimed generations of her family. She knew Rebecca might hate her for the deception, but she chose her daughter's survival over her daughter's approval. That's the kind of love that doesn't ask for gratitude, doesn't expect understanding, and doesn't need forgiveness because it was never about the parents' needs. It was about giving the next generation what the previous one never had, a future. Sometimes our parents' greatest gifts come wrapped in mysteries we only solve after they're gone, when their voices live on in the choices that saved us. The fluorescent lights of Portland General Hospital cast harsh shadows across Rebecca Holmes' face as she backed away from the patient bed. Clipboard clutched against her chest like armor. 28 years as head nurse had prepared Marjo Renner for almost everything: car accidents, burns, overdoses, the full spectrum of human suffering. But what lay before her now sent ice through her veins. "Sweet Jesus," Marjo whispered, her weathered hands trembling as she adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses. "I've never seen anything like this." Rebecca couldn't respond. The morphine drip beside her bed offered blessed relief from the agony that had driven her to the emergency room 4 hours earlier. Her hands, both of them, lay propped on sterile pillows, unrecognizable beneath layers of weeping blisters and blackened tissue. Angry red streaks snaked up her forearms like poisonous vines. Marjo composed herself, clearing her throat as she checked the IV line. "Dr. Stone will be here any minute, honey. She's our best infectious disease specialist. If anyone can figure this out, it's Victoria Stone." From the hallway came urgent voices, medical terms flying back and forth with increasing alarm. Words like necrotizing and unprecedented progression filtered through the half-closed door. "They're scared," Rebecca thought through her drug-induced haze. "The doctors are actually scared." 5 days ago, Rebecca had been whole. Grieving, yes. The 3rd anniversary of David's death still felt like yesterday, but physically intact. 5 days ago, the small cluster of blisters on her right palm had seemed like nothing more than an allergic reaction to the cleaning solutions she'd used on David's beloved marine aquarium. Now, she could barely recognize her own hands. The door swung open, admitting a tall woman with silver-streaked auburn hair. Dr. Victoria Stone carried herself with the authority of someone who had seen everything medicine could throw at her. Her green eyes, sharp behind tortoiseshell glasses, held both compassion and determination. "Rebecca Holmes," she said, her voice crisp as she lifted the chart. "I understand you've had quite the—" Her words died as her gaze fell on Rebecca's ravaged hands. For one telling moment, the doctor's professional mask slipped, revealing something that looked disturbingly like recognition. "My God," Dr. Stone breathed, quickly composing herself. "When did this start?" 5 days ago, Marjo answered, when Rebecca remained silent. "Started as blisters after cleaning a saltwater aquarium. She didn't seek treatment until the pain became unbearable." Stone's jaw tightened as she gently lifted Rebecca's wrist with gloved hands. "These red streaks indicate rapid lymphatic spread. The tissue death is advancing approximately 1 centimeter every 4 hours. Has anyone taken cultures?" "Lab's processing them now," Marjo replied. "Initial microscopy shows what appears to be Vibrio vulnificus, but there's something else present, something they can't identify." Rebecca watched through half-lidded eyes as the doctor's expression grew increasingly troubled. "Get infectious disease control up here immediately. Full isolation protocols, and I want those culture results within the hour." Stone turned to Rebecca, her voice gentling. "Mrs. Holmes, I need to ask about your medical history and about this aquarium." "Can it wait?" Marjo interjected. "She's barely conscious." "No," Stone said firmly. "Based on what I'm seeing, we have approximately 48 hours before the tissue damage becomes irreversible. Without proper treatment, she could lose both hands." The words cut through Rebecca's morphine fog like ice water. Lose both hands. She tried to flex her fingers, but they responded with searing pain rather than movement. "The aquarium," Rebecca managed, her voice a dry whisper. "It was David's, my boyfriend. He died 3 years ago." Stone nodded, pulling up a chair. "How long has the tank been without maintenance?" "Since he died, I couldn't bring myself to clean it. It was the last thing we worked on together." Something flickered across Stone's face, recognition again, or perhaps concern. Ms. Holmes, was your mother Dr. Anna Holmes from the Oregon Marine Research Institute? Rebecca's eyes widened. Yes, she died when I was 22. How did you? I treated your mother, Stone interrupted, turning to Marjo with newfound urgency. Get me Anna Holmes' complete medical records immediately. And call Dr. Peterson in microbiology. Tell him we need full genomic sequencing on whatever they find in those cultures. Marjo hurried from the room, leaving Rebecca alone with Stone and the steady beeping of monitors. Beyond the door, she could hear the hospital mobilizing isolation protocols being implemented, specialists being summoned. Dr. Stone, Rebecca whispered, fighting the morphine to form coherent thoughts. What's happening to me? The older woman's expression softened, her hand coming to rest on Rebecca's shoulder. Something I've seen only once before, Rebecca. In your mother. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But this time, we're going to fight it differently. This time, we have a chance to win. As Rebecca drifted back into medicated darkness, the last thing she saw was Stone's determined face, illuminated by the harsh hospital lights, speaking urgently into a phone. The last thought that crossed her mind was of David's aquarium, still sitting in her apartment, water still cloudy with the bacteria that was now consuming her flesh. The same bacteria that had somehow claimed her mother's life 9 years before. The clock was ticking. 3 weeks earlier, Rebecca stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her coastal apartment, watching storm clouds gather over the Columbia River. The gray November light cast David's marine aquarium in melancholy shadows, its corners thick with algae. The decorative coral formations and miniature shipwreck were barely visible beneath layers of neglect. 2 yellow-tailed damselfish, the sole survivors of what had once been a vibrant underwater ecosystem, drifted listlessly through the murky water. I should really clean that thing, she muttered to herself. The same thought she'd had every day for nearly 3 years. Cleaning it meant acknowledging it was just an aquarium now, not a living memorial. Not the last project she and David had worked on together before the drunk driver on Interstate 84 took him away forever. Rebecca traced a finger along the dusty glass, leaving a clean streak. Just beneath the surface, one of the damselfish followed her movement, its bright yellow scales catching what little light filtered through the murky water. David had named it Skipper, insisting every proper marine tank needed a captain to keep order among the other fish. What do you think, Skipper? She asked softly. Time to get your house in order. The fish darted away, disappearing behind the coral formation. Rebecca sighed, turning back to the window. Below, fishing boats rocked in the harbor as they had for generations in this Pacific Northwest port city. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, Jessica, no doubt checking to make sure she was still planning to attend the art exhibition tonight. 3 years of gentle but persistent efforts to pull Rebecca back into the world of the living. She picked up the phone, confirming with a quick text that yes, she would be there, and no, she didn't need a ride. Some days, the thought of returning to her research at the Marine Biology Institute seemed almost possible. Today wasn't one of those days. Rebecca's gaze drifted to the framed photograph on her bookshelf. David grinning beside the aquarium on the day they'd set it up, his arms around her waist, both of them laughing. They'd met in marine biology class at Portland State, bonding over their shared fascination with with ocean ecosystems. While Rebecca had been drawn to the scientific aspects, David had approached the tank as an artist, creating miniature underwater landscapes with the eye of a filmmaker. "You've got the brains, Becca," he used to say. "I've got the vision. Together we're unstoppable." Unstoppable, until a drunk driver on a rainy night stopped everything. Rebecca moved to her desk, shuffling through unopened mail. Bills, credit card offers, and her hand paused over an official-looking envelope from Portland General Hospital. Probably another insurance question about her mother's old medical bills. Even 9 years after Dr. Anna Holmes' death, the paperwork occasionally resurfaced like unwelcome ghosts. She tossed the envelope aside, unopened. Her mother's illness had been another turning point, forcing Rebecca to abandon her graduate studies to care for her during those final terrible months. The doctors had never quite pinpointed what had caused the rapid deterioration. Some rare infection that had begun in her hands and spread throughout her system, resistant to every treatment they tried. "Tragedy comes in threes," her mother used to say matter-of-factly. First Rebecca's father leaving when she was 14, then her mother's illness 8 years later, and finally David's accident. Rebecca sometimes wondered if she'd exhausted her lifetime quota of misfortune, or if more waited around the corner. The storm broke outside, rain lashing against the windows. Rebecca glanced at her watch. 2 hours until the exhibition. If she was going to make an appearance, she should start getting ready. Jessica had been so excited about this show, featuring local artists' interpretations of marine life. In another life, David's work might have been among them. As she headed toward the shower, Rebecca paused once more by the aquarium, making a decision. This weekend, she would clean it properly. Not empty it, she wasn't ready for that step, but at least make it a proper home again for Skipper and his silent companion. A small step toward reclaiming some normalcy in her life. "You'd approve, wouldn't you?" she whispered to David's photograph. The smiling face gave no answer. Later that evening, dressed in a simple black dress she hadn't worn since the funeral, Rebecca navigated the crowded gallery space. Jessica spotted her immediately, breaking away from a conversation to envelope her in a tight hug. "You came," Jessica exclaimed, pulling back to examine her friend. "And you look like an actual human being tonight." "As opposed to what?" Rebecca asked with a half-smile. "As opposed to the hermit you've been impersonating for the past 3 years. Jessica handed her a glass of wine. "Come on, there's someone I want you to meet. He's doing incredible work with underwater photography, right up your alley." "Jess, I told you I'm not interested in." "It's professional, not personal," Jessica insisted, already guiding her through the crowd. His exhibition focuses on the impact of climate change on Pacific Northwest marine ecosystems. The kind of thing you used to care about. Remember. The slight sting in Jessica's words wasn't lost on Rebecca. Her friend had been endlessly patient, but that patience was beginning to wear thin. 3 years was a long time to put life on hold, even for grief as profound as Rebecca's. The gallery event passed in a blur of small talk and feigned interest. Rebecca found herself checking her watch, counting down the minutes until she could reasonably escape. Back in her apartment, she kicked off her heels and immediately went to the aquarium, watching the damselfish swim lazy circles in their cloudy domain. "Tomorrow," she promised, tapping the glass. "Tomorrow will get you cleaned up." That night, Rebecca dreamed of her mother, They were walking along the Oregon coast, collecting sea glass as they had when Rebecca was a child. Her mother's hands, always her most expressive feature, were covered in strange dark patches, but she didn't seem to notice or care. "The ocean remembers," her mother said in the dream, pressing a piece of blue sea glass into Rebecca's palm. "It holds onto things we try to forget." Rebecca woke with a start, morning sunlight streaming through her bedroom window. For a moment, the dream lingered, her mother's voice still echoing. She glanced at her own hands, half expecting to see dark patches blooming across her skin. The weekend arrived with clear skies and a fresh breeze off the Pacific. Rebecca gathered cleaning supplies beside the aquarium, determined to finally tackle the project. She found David's old maintenance log in the drawer. Beneath the tank stand detailed notes about water parameters, feeding schedules, and the specific needs of each species. His handwriting brought a familiar ache to her chest, but not as sharp as it once had been. Progress, she supposed. "All right, Skipper," she said, rolling up her sleeves. "Let's get your house in order." Rebecca worked methodically, referring occasionally to David's notes. She carefully transferred the 2 damselfish to a temporary container, then began dismantling the decorations, scrubbing away months of accumulated algae. The water, when she began siphoning it out, was cloudier than she'd realized, with an unpleasant smell that made her wrinkle her nose. "How have you guys survived in this?" she murmured to the fish in their temporary home. "Tough little sailors, aren't you?" As she reached into the tank to remove pieces of coral, a sharp pain stung her right palm. Rebecca pulled her hand back, examining the small cut where a broken fragment of artificial coral had sliced her skin. A thin line of blood welled up, mixing with the tank water that coated her fingers. "Damn it," she muttered, rinsing her hand under the tap. The cut was minor, barely worth a bandage. She dried her hand on a towel and continued working, never giving the small wound another thought. She couldn't have known that in that moment, as tank water mingled with her blood, a microscopic invader had found its way into her system. An invader that had been waiting patiently in the neglected aquarium for nearly 3 years, growing stronger in the stagnant conditions, evolving into something the medical textbooks had yet to classify. The first invisible spore of what would eventually bring Rebecca Holmes to the brink of disaster had found its host. Rebecca awoke to the sound of movement in her hospital room. The fog of medication had lifted somewhat, leaving behind a throbbing pain that radiated from her hands up to her elbows. She blinked against the morning light filtering through the blinds, struggling to orient herself. "Well, look who's rejoined the land of the living," came Marjo Renner's steady voice. The head nurse was adjusting monitors beside Rebecca's bed, her experienced hands moving with practiced efficiency. "How's the pain, honey?" Scale of 1 to 10, Rebecca swallowed, her throat dry as sandpaper. 8, she managed, maybe 9. "That tracks with what your vitals are telling me." Marjo reached for a paper cup of water, holding the straw to Rebecca's lips. "Small sips now. Dr. Stone adjusted your pain medication, but we're trying to keep you alert enough for the consultation this morning." As the cool water soothed her throat, Rebecca's gaze drifted to her hands, still propped on pillows. The sight sent a fresh wave of panic through her. The blisters had multiplied overnight, some having burst to reveal raw flesh beneath. The blackened areas had expanded, and the red streaks now extended past her wrists. disappearing beneath the hospital gown at her elbows. "They're worse," she whispered. Marjo's expression remained professionally neutral, but her eyes betrayed concern. "The infection is aggressive, no point sugarcoating it. But we're aggressive too, honey. Got the best minds in the hospital working on your case." "Am I going to lose them?" Rebecca asked, voicing the fear that had haunted her morphine dreams. "My hands." Marjo paused in her duties, meeting Rebecca's gaze directly. "Dr. Stone is doing everything possible to prevent that outcome. But I won't lie to you, it's a possibility we need to prepare for." Rebecca closed her eyes, fighting back tears. Without her hands, what would she be? Who would she be? She thought of all the things she took for granted, preparing meals, typing on her laptop, turning pages in a book, someday returning to her laboratory work. All potentially gone, because she'd neglected an aquarium cleaning for 3 years. "This is my punishment," she thought bitterly, "for holding onto the past, for not letting go when I should have." "Now I can practically hear those wheels turning in your head," Marjo said, interrupting Rebecca's spiral of self-recrimination. "And I'd bet my pension they're not spinning in a helpful direction." Rebecca opened her eyes to find the older woman studying her with surprising gentleness. "Worrying is like a rocking chair," Marjo continued, checking Rebecca's IV line. "Gives you something to do but doesn't get you anywhere. My grandmother used to say that, and she lived to be 99. Hard not to worry when they're talking about amputation," Rebecca replied, her voice breaking. "Nobody's made any decisions yet," Marjo corrected firmly. "And fretting yourself sick won't help those antibiotics do their job. Besides, you're not the first young person I've seen bounce back from something the doctors thought was impossible." Rebecca tried to take comfort in the nurse's words, but her mind kept returning to the image of herself without hands. How would she feed herself? Dress herself? Would she become dependent on others for the most basic tasks? The thought was almost unbearable. "Has anyone called my father?" she asked suddenly. Marjo consulted the chart. "We have him listed as your emergency contact, but there's a note saying multiple attempts to reach him were unsuccessful. Is there someone else we should try?" Rebecca shook her head slightly. Her father had remarried and moved to Phoenix years ago, their relationship reduced to obligatory holiday phone calls and occasional birthday cards. After her mother died, what little connection they'd maintained had withered further. She doubted he'd come even if they reached him. "Just my friend Jessica Miller," Rebecca said. "She's listed as my secondary contact." "Miss Miller has been called," Marjo confirmed. "Left word that she's driving down from Seattle and should be here by noon." At least Jess would come. Reliable, pushy, well-meaning Jess, who never let Rebecca retreat too far into herself, who kept inviting her to events even when Rebecca declined 9 times out of 10, who checked in weekly without fail for 3 solid years. The door opened, admitting Dr. Stone and 2 other physicians Rebecca didn't recognize. From their serious expressions, this wasn't a social call. "Ms. Holmes," Stone began, approaching the bedside, "how are you feeling this morning?" "Like my hands are being eaten alive," Rebecca replied bluntly. "Which I guess they are." Stone nodded, appreciating the directness. "I'd like to introduce Dr. Martinez, our hand surgery specialist, and Dr. Williams from infectious disease. We've been reviewing your case and the preliminary lab results." Rebecca's stomach tightened, and the cultures have confirmed Vibrio vulnificus as the primary pathogen. but it's an unusually virulent strain, Stone explained. There's also evidence of a secondary infection with what appears to be a previously unknown marine bacteria. The combination is exceedingly rare, especially with this level of tissue invasion, both typically from contaminated water sources, Dr. Williams added. The combination suggests prolonged exposure to a highly concentrated bacterial environment. Rebecca nodded mechanically, trying to process the information. What's the treatment plan? The three doctors exchanged glances, a silent communication that sent another wave of dread through Rebecca. We've started you on a combination of powerful antibiotics, Stone said carefully. However, the infection is progressing despite this intervention. The next 24 to 48 hours will be critical in determining whether the medications can halt the advance. Martinez stepped forward. Miss Holmes, I need to be direct with you. If the infection continues to progress at its current rate, we may need to consider surgical intervention to prevent further spread. Surgical intervention, Rebecca repeated flatly. You mean amputation? That would be a last resort, Martinez assured her. We would begin with debridement of the affected tissue, removing only what is necessary. But you need to understand that if the infection reaches deeper structures, tendons, blood vessels, bone, more extensive measures may become unavoidable. Rebecca stared at the ceiling, fighting the urge to scream. 3 years of grief and isolation, slowly working her way back toward normal life, and now this. It was almost laughable in its cruelty. Ms. Holmes, Stone said gently, I understand this is overwhelming, but there's something else we need to discuss. She nodded to the other doctors, who quietly exited the room, leaving only Stone, Marjo, and Rebecca. What haven't you told me? Rebecca asked, suddenly alert. Stone pulled up a chair, sitting at eye level with Rebecca. I mentioned yesterday that I treated your mother. What I didn't say is that she presented with a remarkably similar infection pattern. Rebecca's breath caught. What? 9 years ago, your mother was admitted with a progressive infection that began in her hands and proved resistant to standard treatments. Stone continued. The presentation was different enough that I didn't make the connection immediately. But after reviewing her records last night, the similarities are striking. Are you saying this is the same thing that killed my mother? Rebecca whispered. I'm saying there may be a connection we don't yet understand, Stone replied carefully. Your mother's case progressed differently, more systemically, affecting her internal organs. We're hopeful that by catching your infection earlier, we can prevent that progression. Rebecca's mind raced, fragments of memory surfacing. Her mother's hands, always hidden in gloves toward the end. The doctor's confused expressions. The hushed conversations that stopped when Rebecca entered the room. How did she get it? Rebecca asked. My mother. That was never definitively established, Stone admitted. There was some speculation about contaminated water exposure during her work with the Marine Research Institute. She had been collecting samples from coastal areas. The same coastal areas where David had collected specimens for their aquarium. The connection was too specific to be coincidence. Dr. Stone, Rebecca said slowly, the fish in David's tank, they came from local waters. Specimens he collected for our research. Could that be the link? A flicker of understanding crossed the doctor's face. It's certainly possible. Some pathogens can remain dormant in closed systems for years, especially if conditions favor their growth. Marjo, who had been quietly monitoring Rebecca's vitals, spoke up. "Doc, her fever's rising again. 101.6 and climbing." Stone stood quickly. "We need to adjust the antibiotic protocol immediately and get that tank tested. Whatever's in there might give us the key to fighting this." As they rushed to respond to her worsening condition, Rebecca closed her eyes, memories of her mother's final days mingling with the pain radiating through her arms. The past she couldn't let go of had reached forward through time to claim her through something as innocent as a neglected aquarium. "I'm sorry, David," she whispered to herself. "I should have let you go." The Saturday morning Rebecca decided to clean David's aquarium had dawned bright and clear, a rare, perfect autumn day in Portland. She'd risen early, motivated by a newfound determination that had been missing for months. The gallery opening the night before, while uncomfortable at times, had reminded her that life continued outside the walls of her grief. She stood in her kitchen, sipping coffee and making a mental list of supplies she'd need. David had been meticulous about tank maintenance, keeping a special bucket, siphon hoses, algae scrapers, and water testing kits in the storage closet. Rebecca hadn't touched any of it since his death. "Today's the day, Skipper," she called to the aquarium across the room. "No more neglect. Your home is getting a complete overhaul." Retrieving the supplies felt like opening a time capsule. Each item was exactly where David had left it, his organizational system still intact. Rebecca found herself running her fingers along the equipment, remembering how he demonstrated proper technique for gravel cleaning or filter maintenance, his hands confident and sure. "The trick is to vacuum the substrate without disturbing the biological balance," he'd explained once, his voice taking on the passionate tone reserved for things he truly cared about. "It's an art form, Becca, not just cleaning." She smiled at the memory, feeling a lightness she hadn't experienced in months. Perhaps this was what moving forward looked like, not forgetting David, but reclaiming the parts of life they'd shared without being paralyzed by loss. Rebecca set up her workstation methodically, laying out towels to catch spills and preparing a temporary container for the fish. She consulted David's maintenance log, noting the specific gravity and pH levels he'd maintained for the saltwater environment. The tank had once housed a diverse collection of anemones, coral, and colorful tropical fish. Now only the 2 hardy damselfish remained, survivors of her prolonged neglect. She rolled up her sleeves and began by carefully netting the fish, transferring them to the prepared container. "Sorry about the downgrade in accommodations, guys," she told them as they darted nervously in their temporary home. "It's just for a few hours." Next came the dismantling of decorations. The miniature shipwrecked David had found at a nautical antique store, various pieces of artificial coral and rocks collected from their favorite beach. Each piece was coated in a thick layer of algae, the once vibrant colors muted beneath the green film. The water was cloudier than she'd realized, with a slightly foul odor that made her wrinkle her nose. How had she let it get so bad? The filter had stopped working months ago, and she'd never bothered to replace it, assuming the remaining fish would eventually die off like the others. Instead, they'd adapted to the deteriorating conditions, becoming as resilient as Rebecca herself had been forced to become. "You guys are survivors," she murmured, watching them swim in their temporary container. I'll give you that. She began siphoning the old water, directing it into a bucket for disposal. The smell grew stronger as she disturbed the settled debris at the bottom of the tank. Rebecca considered finding a mask to wear, but decided to power through. This was her penance for the neglect breathing in the consequences of her inaction. With most of the water removed, she could now reach inside to remove the gravel and remaining decorations. A piece of artificial coral had partially broken, its sharp edges hidden beneath the murky water. As Rebecca reached in to lift out a handful of gravel, she felt a sudden sharp pain across her palm. "Ouch, damn it," she hissed, withdrawing her hand to find a thin line of blood welling up from a cut across her right palm. It wasn't deep, but it stung fiercely, especially when the tank water made contact with the open wound. Rebecca rinsed her hand under the kitchen faucet, watching the blood thin and disappear down the drain. She should probably clean the cut properly, maybe apply some antibiotic ointment, but the first aid kit was in the bathroom, and she was determined to finish what she'd started. The cut wasn't serious, barely more than a paper cut. She dried her hand on a paper towel and continued working, ignoring the occasional sting when tank water splashed into the small wound. By midday, she had completely dismantled the tank, scrubbed every component, and was beginning the process of reassembly. Her phone rang as she was rinsing the gravel. Jessica's name flashed on the screen. "Look at you, calling before noon on a Saturday," Rebecca answered, cradling the phone against her shoulder as she continued working. "I thought you'd be sleeping off last night's wine," Jessica replied. "Please, that was hardly enough to give me a hangover," Rebecca said, feeling a twinge of guilt. "I'm calling to check on you. You disappeared so quickly last night." "Sorry about that," Rebecca said. "I hit my social limit, but I'm glad I went. Really." Jessica sounded genuinely surprised. "Because you looked like someone being slowly tortured the entire time." Rebecca laughed, the sound unfamiliar to her own ears. "Only mildly tortured, but it was good to get out. Actually, I'm cleaning David's aquarium right now." A brief silence followed. When Jessica spoke again, her voice was carefully neutral. "That's a big step, Becca." "It's just a cleaning, not an exorcism," Rebecca replied, defensive despite herself. "The poor fish have been living in squalor. I should have done this months ago." "I didn't mean it like that," Jessica backpedaled. "I think it's great, it's progress." Progress? The word hung between them, loaded with all the expectations Jessica had been too kind to voice over the past 3 years. The expectation that Rebecca would eventually move on, whatever that meant. That she would date again, finish her degree, return to the research she'd abandoned. That she would stop living, as if she too had died on that rainy night with David. "Yeah, well, baby steps," Rebecca said finally. "Oh, when I cut myself on a broken decoration, do you think I need a tetanus shot?" "When was your last one?" Jessica asked. Rebecca thought back. "I don't remember, college maybe." "If it's been more than 5 years, you should probably get one," Jessica advised. "Was it rusty?" "It was artificial coral, so no rust. But it's been sitting in some pretty disgusting water. Clean it well with soap and water, put on some antibiotic cream, and keep an eye on it," Jessica suggested. "If it starts looking red or inflamed, then worry. How deep is it?" Rebecca examined her palm, where the cut had already stopped bleeding. "Not deep at all, more like a scratch." "You'll live," Jessica declared. "Hey, want to get lunch tomorrow? I can drive down to your place. The invitation was tempting. 2 social engagements in one weekend would be a record for Rebecca's recent life. Sure, she found herself saying, that would be nice. After hanging up, Rebecca returned to her task with renewed energy. By late afternoon, the tank was completely reassembled, filled with fresh water treated with proper additives for a saltwater environment. The decorations, minus the broken coral, were arranged artfully the way David would have done. The filter hummed quietly, circulating crystal-clear water. "Welcome home, guys," she said, carefully returning Skipper and his companion to their improved habitat. The fish darted around excitedly, exploring their clean surroundings as if seeing them for the first time. Rebecca stood back, admiring her work with a sense of accomplishment she hadn't felt in ages. The tank looked almost as good as it had when David was alive. Almost, but not quite. His artistic touch was missing. That indefinable quality he brought to everything he created. Her hand throbbed slightly, and she realized she'd forgotten to clean the cut properly. In the bathroom, she washed it thoroughly with soap and water, noticing that the edges looked slightly puffy. She applied a generous amount of antibiotic ointment and covered it with a bandage, making a mental note to check it again before bed. That evening, Rebecca ordered takeout from her favorite Thai restaurant, another small luxury she denied herself recently, and sat by the window watching the fish explore their rejuvenated home while the sun set over the Columbia River. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of forward momentum. The cut on her palm itched beneath the bandage, but she resisted the urge to scratch it. By morning, the area around the wound had developed a cluster of tiny blisters, which Rebecca dismissed as an allergic reaction to the adhesive in the bandage. She applied more antibiotic ointment, covered it with a different type of bandage, and thought nothing more of it as she prepared for Jessica's visit. She couldn't have known that by Tuesday, those innocent-looking blisters would multiply and spread. That by Wednesday, the first signs of tissue death would appear. That by Thursday morning, the pain would become unbearable, sending her to the emergency room where Marjo Renner would back away from her bed in horror, whispering, "Sweet Jesus, I've never seen anything like this." She couldn't have known that with every passing hour, the clock ticking down to save her hands, and possibly her life, was already running. "We're losing ground," Dr. Stone stated grimly, examining the progression charts spread across the conference room table. The clock on the wall read 2:17 a.m., marking 20 hours since Rebecca Holmes had been admitted. Outside the windows, the Pacific Northwest night was pitch black, a steady rain tapping against the glass like impatient fingers. Around the table sat the hastily assembled response team. Martinez, the hand surgeon, Dr. Williams from infectious disease, Dr. Patel, the hospital's chief microbiologist, and Marjo Renner, who had refused to go off duty despite having worked a double shift. "The antibiotic cocktail isn't penetrating the biofilm the bacteria have formed," Dr. Patel explained, pointing to microscope images. "It's unlike anything I've seen before. The organisms appear to be communicating, coordinating their defense mechanisms." "In English, please," Marjo interjected, "for those of us who haven't spent 20 years staring through microscopes." Dr. Patel nodded apologetically. "Basically, the bacteria have created a protective shield that our antibiotics can't penetrate effectively. and they're spreading faster than we can kill them. Stone massaged her temples, fatigue evident in every line of her face. What about hyperbaric oxygen therapy? Could that help? It might, Williams responded, but our chamber is under maintenance. The nearest functional unit is in Seattle. Then we get her to Seattle, Stone decided immediately. In this weather, Marjo gestured toward the window, where lightning briefly illuminated the torrential downpour. The roads are flooding, and air transport is grounded until morning at the earliest. The room fell silent, the gravity of the situation settling over them like a physical weight. Every hour that passed without effective intervention pushed Rebecca closer to amputation, or worse. What about Anna Holmes' case? Martinez asked suddenly. You mentioned similarities, Victoria. Did anything work for her? Stone's expression darkened. No. By the time we understood what we were dealing with, the infection had spread systemically. Nothing we tried made a significant difference. But we caught this earlier, Marjo pointed out, and medical science has advanced in 9 years. True, Stone acknowledged, but without knowing the exact strain we're dealing with, we're still shooting in the dark. She turned to Patel. How much longer until the full genomic sequencing is complete? At least 6 more hours, he replied. The lab is prioritizing it, but it's a complex analysis. Stone stood abruptly. We don't have 6 hours. I want that tank analyzed immediately. Whatever's in there might give us the key to fighting this. In Rebecca's apartment, Jessica Miller stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the marine aquarium that glowed eerily in the darkened living room. The hospital's urgent call had sent her racing to Rebecca's place to collect water samples for analysis. Armed with sterile containers and strict instructions not to touch the water directly. Of all the things, Jessica whispered to herself, eyeing the tank warily. This innocuous aquarium, the last physical connection between Rebecca and David, had somehow harbored something deadly enough to land her friend in isolation. She approached cautiously, as if the tank might suddenly shatter and spray its contents across the room. The 2 damselfish swam peacefully, oblivious to the havoc their home had wreaked. How are you 2 not affected? She murmured, carefully unscrewing the lid of the collection container. Following the instructions she'd been given, Jessica used the sterile pipette to draw water from different areas of the tank. As she worked, her gaze fell on the framed photograph of Rebecca and David beside the tank. They looked so happy, so full of possibility. Jessica remembered the day it was taken. She'd been the photographer, capturing the moment they'd finished setting up their research project that was clearly more about their shared passion than any academic requirement. Oh, Becca, she sighed, securing the samples. Why couldn't you just let go? In the hospital laboratory, Dr. Patel hunched over a microscope, his eyes burning from hours of concentrated study. The samples from Rebecca's infected tissue revealed a microbial world in chaos bacteria, multiplying at an alarming rate, consuming healthy cells and spreading outward in an organized pattern that seemed almost deliberate. Come on, give up your secrets, he muttered, adjusting the focus. Somewhere in this microscopic battlefield was the key to stopping the invasion, if only he could identify it before time ran out. His phone buzzed with a text from Stone. Any progress? He typed back a quick negative response, knowing it wasn't what she wanted to hear. The clock on the wall showed 3:42 a.m. The critical window was narrowing by the minute. "I'm sorry, David. I should have let you go." Marjo looked up from her charting to find Rebecca awake, her eyes glassy with fever as she stared at the ceiling. The infection had progressed despite their best efforts. The red streaks were now visible at her shoulders. Her temperature had spiked to 103.4, and the pain medication was barely keeping her comfortable. "Who are you talking to, honey?" Marjo asked gently, approaching the bed. Rebecca's gaze drifted to Marjo, though it was unclear if she truly saw her. "David, my boyfriend, he died." "I know, sweetheart. The doctors mentioned that the aquarium was his." Rebecca continued, her voice distant. "I couldn't empty it, couldn't say goodbye." A tear slipped down her flushed cheek. "Now look what happened." Marjo checked Rebecca's IV line, adjusting the flow rate slightly. "You couldn't have known this would happen. Nobody could." "My mother knew," Rebecca whispered. "She warned me in my dream. The ocean remembers," she said. "It holds onto things we try to forget." Marjo felt a chill despite the warmth of the room. Fever-induced delirium, most likely, but unsettling nonetheless. "Try to rest, honey. Save your strength." "Am I going to die?" Rebecca asked suddenly, her voice clearer. "Like my mother did." The question caught Marjo off guard. In 30 years of nursing, she developed a sixth sense about which patients were truly in danger. Rebecca's infection was severe, potentially life-altering, but Marjo didn't sense that death was imminent. Still, she'd learned long ago not to make promises she couldn't keep. "Not if Victoria Stone has anything to say about it," Marjo replied firmly. "That woman is the most stubborn doctor I've ever worked with. She doesn't like to lose." Rebecca seemed to accept this, her eyes drifting closed again. "I'm tired of holding on," she murmured. "So tired." Marjo watched as Rebecca slipped back into restless sleep, her bandaged hands twitching occasionally, as if trying to grasp something just out of reach. "9 years ago, I failed Anna Holmes," Dr. Stone said, staring out the window of her office as dawn broke over the harbor. "I was younger then, less experienced. We tried everything available at the time, but the infection moved too quickly." Williams sat across from her, reviewing Anna's old medical records. "You can't blame yourself, Victoria. From what I'm seeing here, her case presented differently more systemic involvement from the start." "But the source appears to be the same," Stone insisted. "Local waters, marine bacteria that somehow mutated into something more aggressive." She turned from the window. Anna worked for the Marine Research Institute. She was collecting water samples from the same areas where Rebecca's boyfriend gathered specimens for their aquarium. "Could be coincidence," Williams suggested. "I don't believe in coincidences," Stone replied. "Not when the clinical presentation is this similar. There's a connection we're missing." Her phone rang. Dr. Patel from the lab. Stone answered immediately, putting it on speaker. "I've got something," Patel said without preamble. "The tank water sample just arrived. There's a match with the bacteria in Rebecca's tissue, but with a crucial difference. The tank strain has a mutation that makes it resistant to standard antibiotics." "We already knew that," Stone said impatiently. "Yes, but here's the interesting part," Patel continued. "This mutation is almost identical to one documented in a research paper from 9 years ago. A study of antibiotic-resistant bacteria found in coastal water samples from Oregon." Stone's eyes widened. "Who authored the paper?" "A team from the Marine Research Institute," Patel replied. Lead author was Dr. Anna Holmes. Anna Holmes, stone-breathed. Rebecca's mother. There's more, Patel added. The mutation appears to be triggered by prolonged exposure to stagnant conditions, especially in the presence of certain trace elements commonly found in aquarium environments. Stone exchanged a significant look with Williams. So the bacteria in the tank essentially evolved over time, becoming more virulent the longer it remained undisturbed. Exactly, Patel confirmed. And based on what we're seeing, the strain has developed a novel method of tissue invasion that allows it to spread much more rapidly than typical marine bacteria. Can you identify any weaknesses? Stone pressed. Anything we can exploit? Possibly, Patel said, excitement creeping into his voice. The mutation that grants antibiotic resistance also appears to create a vulnerability to certain metallic compounds, specifically silver-based antimicrobials. I'm running tests now to confirm. Stone felt the first stirring of hope since Rebecca had been admitted. Send me everything you have, and track down a copy of Anna Holmes' original research. If she identified this strain 9 years ago, her work might hold the key to fighting it now. As she hung up, Stone turned to Williams. Get me the strongest silver-based antimicrobial compounds we have access to. And call Seattle. I want that hyperbaric chamber ready the moment the weather clears. The race against time had taken a new direction, but the clock continued its relentless countdown. Outside, the storm was beginning to break, thin rays of sunlight piercing through the clouds like fragile strands of hope. Jessica Miller burst through the hospital entrance, rainwater streaming from her jacket, despite the umbrella she'd abandoned in the parking lot. The storm had intensified during her drive back from the Marine Research Institute, turning the coastal highway into a treacherous ribbon of standing water and limited visibility. But the precious cargo she carried, Anna Holmes' original research files, retrieved from the Institute's archives, had made the journey essential. I need to see Dr. Victoria Stone immediately, she told the front desk attendant, holding up the waterproof document case. It's about Rebecca Holmes. These are the files she's waiting for. Minutes later, Jessica found herself ushered into a conference room where Stone, Williams, and several other medical staff were huddled around laptop screens and stacks of medical journals. The atmosphere was tense, faces drawn with fatigue and worry. You found them, Stone said, her professional composure briefly giving way to naked relief. Anna's original research notes. It wasn't easy, Jessica replied, opening the case to reveal several file folders and a weathered field notebook. The Institute had archived most of her work, but her supervisor remembered her and helped me locate these. Some of it was still in a box marked for disposal. She hesitated, then added, "How's Rebecca?" Stone's expression darkened. Critical, but stable. The infection continues to advance despite our best efforts. These files might be our last best hope for understanding what we're dealing with. Patel reached for the notebook, opening it carefully. Anna Holmes' handwriting filled the page's meticulous notes, hand-drawn diagrams, and data tables documenting her work, sampling coastal waters along the Oregon shoreline. May 14th, 2015, he read aloud. Unusual bacterial presence detected in samples from Tillamook Bay North. Preliminary analysis suggests Vibrio species with anomalous growth pattern and unexpected antibiotic resistance. Further investigation warranted. Stone leaned over his shoulder. That's less than a mile from where Rebecca lives now, and where her mother worked. Patel continued scanning the notebook, flipping pages rapidly, until stopping at an entry from 3 months later. "This is it," he said, excitement rising in his voice. "August 3rd, 2015. Confirmed novel strain of Vibrio vulnificus in Tillamook Bay samples. Resistance to standard antibiotics, likely due to prolonged exposure to agricultural runoff containing trace antibiotics. Of particular concern is the strain's enhanced virulence when exposed to metallic compounds commonly found in marine equipment." Metallic compounds, Stone frowned. "But our tests suggested silver-based compounds might be effective against the strain in Rebecca's tissue." "Wait," Patel continued reading. September 17, 2015. Further laboratory analysis reveals complex relationship with metallic elements. Initial exposure enhances virulence, but sustained high-concentration exposure proves bactericidal. Potential treatment implications if infection occurs. Stone turned to one of the other doctors. "Get me Rebecca's chart, now." As the doctor hurried from the room, she returned her attention to the notebook. Anna knew. She identified the risk and was researching potential treatments. But if she knew, Jessica asked, why did she herself become infected? A heavy silence fell over the room. Stone's expression was grim as she replied, "Because knowing a risk exists doesn't make you immune to it." Anna was collecting samples, studying this bacteria. One moment of carelessness, one small cut or abrasion while handling contaminated water, just like Rebecca. Jessica whispered. The doctor returned with Rebecca's chart, and Stone scanned it quickly. The timeline fits. Anna Holmes first presented with symptoms in late 2015, approximately 2 months after these last research notes. By then, the infection had already spread systemically. But why wasn't her research connected to her illness? Jessica asked. Medical privacy, Williams explained. Her doctors, including Victoria, knew she worked for the Marine Research Institute, but the details of her specific research weren't part of her medical record, and she was already too sick to communicate clearly by the time Victoria became involved in her case. Patel had continued reading through Anna's notes. "There's more," he said urgently. She documented a potential genetic factor. Some test subjects, laboratory mice, showed increased susceptibility to the bacteria based on a specific genetic marker. She was planning to investigate human genetic factors next. The implications hung in the air like a thunderclap. Stone voiced what everyone was thinking. A genetic predisposition that Anna passed to Rebecca. That's why the infection progressed so rapidly in both of them. "Is that even possible?" Jessica asked. "Absolutely," Patel confirmed. Certain genetic variants can significantly impact immune response to specific pathogens. If Anna and Rebecca share such a variant, then Rebecca was essentially primed for this infection from birth. Stone finished the thought, and when she cut herself while cleaning that tank, she trailed off, the horrifying progression clear to everyone. Jessica sank into a chair, the weight of the revelation settling over her. The aquarium, David's aquarium. All this time, it was a perfect incubator. Stagnant water, traces of metals from the decorative items, minimal filtration, Patel said grimly. Ideal conditions for this particular strain to thrive and mutate further. Does Anna's research say anything about effective treatments? Stone asked urgently. Patel flipped to the final pages of the notebook. She was exploring high-concentration silver compounds as a potential treatment, but these appear to be preliminary findings only. She notes that sustained exposure at precise concentrations showed promising results in laboratory conditions. But there's no indication she developed a complete treatment protocol. Stone straightened, a new determination in her bearing. It's a start. We need to synthesize a silver-based treatment immediately and prepare for aggressive debridement of the affected tissue. She turned to another doctor. Check if the road to Seattle is passable yet. We need that hyperbaric chamber. As the medical team sprang into action, Jessica remained seated, her mind reeling from the connections that had led to this moment. It's almost like fate, she said quietly. David collects specimens from the same waters Anna studied. The tank sits neglected after his death, allowing the bacteria to evolve. Rebecca finally cleans it and becomes infected with the same thing that killed her mother. Science, not fate, Stone corrected, though her tone had softened. But yes, the coincidences are remarkable. Will she survive? Jessica asked bluntly. Stone met her gaze directly. Anna's infection was already systemic when treatment began. Rebecca's is still primarily localized to her hands and arms. That gives us an advantage her mother didn't have. She paused. But I won't lie to you, the next 24 hours are critical. And even if we save her life, she may still lose her hands. The brutal honesty hit Jessica like a physical blow. She thought of Rebecca, brilliant, passionate Rebecca, whose hands had always been in motion, taking notes, examining specimens, gesturing animatedly when discussing her research, who had already lost so much and now stood to lose even more. There's something else you should know, Jessica said suddenly. Something that might be important. Stone raised an eyebrow. Go on. David's death anniversary was last week, Jessica explained. 3 years since the accident. Rebecca's been struggling more than usual lately. That's why I pushed her to come to the gallery opening to get her out of the apartment. She swallowed hard. And that's probably why she finally decided to clean the tank. It was like she was finally ready to move forward, only to be pulled back by this connection to her past. Stone murmured, life rarely concerns itself with fairness. But Rebecca has something her mother didn't. We know what we're fighting now. As if on cue, Patel's phone rang. His expression grew alarmed as he listened to the caller. We need to move quickly, he announced after hanging up. Rebecca's fever has spiked to 104.2, and there are signs the infection is beginning to spread systemically. Stone's face hardened with resolve. Begin synthesizing the silver-based treatment immediately. I want it ready within the hour, and prepare for emergency debridement. She turned to Jessica. Anna Holmes couldn't save herself, but she may have just saved her daughter. These research notes could make all the difference. As the doctors hurried from the room, Jessica remained behind, her gaze falling on Anna's weathered notebook. Inside were the careful observations of a scientist who had unwittingly documented the very thing that would eventually kill her, and that now threatened her daughter's life. The connection across time and loss was both beautiful and terrible, a strand of fate disguised as scientific coincidence. Hold on, Becca, Jessica whispered. Your mother left you the map. Now we just need to follow it home. Rebecca floated in a fever dream, untethered from time and place. In her delirium, she stood on the rocky shore of Tillamook Bay, watching as dark water lapped against the stones. The sky above was neither day nor night, but a strange twilight that cast everything in shades of blue and gray. Beside her stood her mother, Anna Holmes, looking exactly as she had before her illness, tall and strong, her weathered hands moving expressively as she spoke. "I tried to warn you, Rebecca," her mother said, her voice carried on the salt wind. "The ocean remembers. It holds on to things we try to forget." "I didn't understand," Rebecca replied, watching as the tide crept higher, water swirling around their ankles. "How could I have known?" Her mother's face softened with compassion. "We never truly know the dangers that surround us. We can only observe, record, and hope our findings help others." She lifted her hands, which now bore the same blackened tissue and angry red streaks that marked Rebecca's own. "Some lessons are written in flesh." The dream shifted. Rebecca was in her apartment, standing before David's aquarium. Inside, the water had turned black as ink, yet somehow transparent enough that she could see the damselfish swimming in desperate circles, their bright scales glowing eerily against the darkness. Behind the tank stood David, his face obscured by shadow. "I kept it for you," Rebecca told him, her voice echoing strangely. "I couldn't let go." "But you have to let go now," David replied, his voice distorted as if coming from underwater. "It's killing you, Becca, just like it killed your mother." Rebecca looked down at her hands, watching in horror as the blackened tissue spread before her eyes, crawling up her arms like living darkness, consuming flesh as it advanced. She tried to scream, but no sound emerged. "Rebecca, Rebecca." The insistent voice pulled her from the nightmare. Rebecca opened her eyes to find Marjo Renner leaning over her, the nurse's familiar face creased with concern. "There you are," Marjo said, relief evident in her tone. "You've been having quite the fever dream, honey. Been calling out for your mother and someone named David." Rebecca tried to speak, but her throat felt raw and parched. Marjo held a straw to her lips, allowing her to take small sips of ice water. "How long?" Rebecca managed. "You've been in and out for about 8 hours, Marjo replied, checking the monitors beside the bed. "Your fever spiked something fierce, had us almighty worried." Rebecca struggled to orient herself, the nightmare images still vivid in her mind. She tried to look at her hands, but found them obscured by new bandages that extended past her elbows. A cold fear slithered down her spine. "My hands," she whispered, "did they?" "They're still attached, if that's what you're asking," Marjo assured her. "But I won't sugarcoat it. There's been significant progression. Dr. Stone performed an emergency debridement while you were out." "Debridement," Rebecca's voice was barely audible. "Surgical removal of infected tissue," Marjo explained gently. She had to be quite aggressive to stay ahead of the spread. Rebecca closed her eyes, trying to process this information through the fog of medication and fever. She couldn't feel her hands at all now, whether from nerve damage or pain medication, she couldn't tell. The uncertainty was almost worse than pain would have been. "Jessica found your mother's research," Marjo continued, adjusting the IV drip. "Dr. Stone thinks it might be the key to fighting this infection. They're trying a new treatment based on her work." Rebecca's eyes flew open. "My mother's research." Marjo nodded. "Apparently, she was studying the very bacteria that infected you. Documented everything in detail. Like mother, like daughter, I suppose both scientists to the core." a memory surfaced through Rebecca's delirium. Her mother, at the kitchen table, methodically noting observations in her field notebook, pausing occasionally to flex her fingers as if they pained her. Rebecca had been home from college that weekend, focused on her own studies, barely paying attention to her mother's work. "I should have asked her more about her research," Rebecca murmured. "Should have paid attention." "Now don't you start that," Marjo admonished gently. "No use dwelling on should-haves. Your mother left behind the information we needed, and that's what matters now." The door opened, admitting Stone and a younger Dr. Rebecca didn't recognize. Their expressions were grave as they approached the bed. "Rebecca," Stone began, her tone measured, "how much do you remember about the last few hours?" "Almost nothing," Rebecca admitted. "Marjo mentioned a debridement." Stone nodded. "Yes, the infection was advancing rapidly despite our initial treatments. We had to remove significant amounts of affected tissue to prevent further spread." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "We're now implementing a treatment protocol based partly on your mother's research. A silver-based compound that appears to be effective against this particular strain." "Will it work?" Rebecca asked directly. "We're cautiously optimistic," Stone replied. "The initial response looks promising, but we're still facing a serious situation." She exchanged a glance with the other doctor before continuing. "Rebecca, I need to prepare you for what you'll see when we change your bandages. The debridement was extensive. There will be significant changes to the appearance of your hands." The clinical detachment in Stone's voice sent a chill through Rebecca. "How extensive?" she pressed. Stone sighed. "We had to remove large portions of compromised tissue, particularly on your right hand where the infection began. In some areas, we needed to cut quite deep down to tendon and bone in certain spots." Rebecca felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with her fever. "Function," she managed to ask. "Will I be able to use them?" "It's too early to say definitively," Stone answered honestly. "That will depend on how well the treatments work, how the tissues heal, and how successful any reconstructive surgeries might be." Reconstructive surgeries. The phrase hung in the air like a death knell. Rebecca turned her face away, unable to bear the weight of the doctor's gaze. She thought of all the things her hands had done, taken notes during lectures, adjusted microscopes, handled delicate marine specimens, intertwined with David's fingers on long walks along the shore. Would they ever do any of those things again? "I understand this is overwhelming," Stone continued, her voice softening slightly. "But I want you to know that we're pursuing every possible avenue. Your mother's research has given us insights we wouldn't otherwise have had." "Can I see them?" Rebecca asked suddenly. "My hands, I want to see what I'm dealing with." A tense silence fell over the room. Marjo made a small sound of distress. Stone's expression remained neutral, but her hesitation spoke volumes. "I don't think that's advisable right now," she said finally. "The psychological impact could complicate your recovery. Once we're certain the infection is under control." "They're my hands," Rebecca interrupted, a sudden fierce determination cutting through her fear. "I need to see what's happening to them, please." Stone studied her face for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. "Very well, but I want to be clear. What you'll see is mid-treatment. The appearance now is not necessarily indicative of the final outcome." With careful movements, Marjo and Stone began unwrapping the bandages on Rebecca's right arm first. The sterile gauze peeled away layer by layer, revealing first her forearm crisscrossed with angry red lines, but still recognizably her own. Then her wrist, mottled with bruising from IV sites. And finally, her hand. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. The hand before her barely resembled a hand at all. Large sections of skin and underlying tissue had been removed, creating crater-like depressions that exposed glimpses of yellowish tendons, and in some places, the white gleam of bone. What skin remained was a patchwork of discolored areas, blackened necrosis, surrounded by vivid red inflammation. The fingers were swollen to nearly twice their normal size, the nails blue-black at their bases. "Oh my God," she whispered, unable to tear her gaze away from the ravaged appendage that had once been her right hand. "The appearance is alarming, I know," Stone said quickly. "But much of what you're seeing is necessary surgical intervention to stay ahead of the infection. The blackened areas are necrotic tissue we'll remove in subsequent procedures." But Rebecca barely heard her. All she could think was, this isn't a hand anymore. This is a nightmare made flesh. This is what killed my mother. "Enough," Marjo said firmly, beginning to rewrap the bandages. "That's quite enough for now." As the horrific sight was covered once more, Rebecca felt something inside her break free. A sob that rose from somewhere deeper than her physical pain, deeper even than her fear. It was the sound of surrender, of realizing that nothing would ever be the same again. "Why did this happen?" she asked through her tears, her voice cracking. "Why us? Why this bacteria?" Stone's professional composure faltered slightly, revealing a glimpse of the human being beneath the doctor's mask. "Science can tell us how, Rebecca, but rarely why. Your mother was studying something dangerous, and that danger found its way to you through a series of unlikely connections. It's not fair, it's not just, it simply is." As Rebecca closed her eyes, the image of her ravaged hand remained burned into her mind. A vision of horror that she knew would haunt her dreams for years to come, if she survived to have them. "Rest now," Marjo murmured, adjusting the pain medication. "Sometimes the only way past the nightmare is through it." The waiting room of Portland General Hospital's intensive care unit had become Jessica Miller's second home over the past 72 hours. She'd claimed a corner near the window, her laptop open on the small table beside a collection of empty coffee cups and half-eaten sandwiches from the cafeteria. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a crisp autumn day with sunlight glinting off the Columbia River visible in the distance. Jessica rubbed her eyes, blurry from lack of sleep, and too many hours staring at medical research papers. Since discovering Anna Holmes' notebooks, she'd been obsessively searching for any additional information that might help Rebecca, combing through scientific journals, marine biology publications, and environmental reports from the past decade. "You look like you could use this," came a gravelly voice. Marjo Renner stood before her, holding out a steaming cup of coffee. "It's the good stuff from the doctor's lounge, not that swill from the cafeteria." "Thanks," Jessica said gratefully, accepting the cup. "Any news?" Marjo settled into the chair opposite her, movements betraying the bone-deep fatigue of someone who had been on their feet far too long. "That's what I came to tell you. Dr. Stone just finished the latest round of cultures." She paused, a smile breaking across her weathered face. "The infection has stopped spreading." Jessica nearly spilled her coffee. "Seriously, the treatment is working." "Appears so," Marjo confirmed. The silver-based compound, combined with the aggressive debridement and specialized antibiotics, it's turning the tide. The lab is showing significant reduction in bacterial load. Oh, thank God, Jessica breathed, feeling tears prick her eyes. So she's going to be okay. Marjo's expression tempered. She's not out of the woods yet, as my granddaddy would say. The systemic infection is responding to treatment, but the damage to her hands, she trailed off, searching for the right words. It's extensive, honey. There's no sugarcoating that. Jessica set down her coffee, the momentary elation giving way to a more complicated reality. How extensive? Dr. Stone had to remove large portions of tissue, especially on the right hand where the infection began. We're talking significant reconstruction will be needed, and even then, full function isn't guaranteed. The words landed like stones, heavy with implication. Jessica thought of Rebecca's hands always in motion, sketching observations, manipulating lab equipment, gesturing animatedly when discussing her research. Hands that define not just what Rebecca did, but in many ways who she was. Has she seen them? Jessica asked quietly. Marjo nodded, her expression grim. Insisted on it against Dr. Stone's advice. It was difficult, the kind of moment that changes a person. Can I see her? She's sleeping now. The procedure was exhausting, and her body needs rest to continue fighting, Marjo replied. Later this afternoon, perhaps. Dr. Stone wants to discuss something with you first, though. With me? Why? Something about Rebecca's blood work, Marjo said. She said it might be important. Before Jessica could press for details, the waiting room door opened, admitting Stone. The infectious disease specialist looked as though she hadn't slept in days, her silver-streaked hair escaping its usual neat bun, dark circles prominent beneath her eyes. Yet there was an energy in her movements, a purposefulness that hadn't been there before. Miss Miller, she acknowledged, taking the seat Marjo vacated. I assume Nurse Renner has updated you on Rebecca's condition. She said the infection has stopped spreading, Jessica confirmed. That's good news, right? Very good news, Stone agreed. The treatment protocol derived from Anna Holmes' research is proving effective. The bacterial load is decreasing, and Rebecca's fever has reduced significantly. Marjo mentioned you wanted to discuss her blood work. Stone nodded, her expression thoughtful. We found something unusual in Rebecca's immunological response, something that may explain why she's responding to treatment when her mother didn't. She pulled a tablet from her coat pocket, bringing up a series of complex medical charts. Despite sharing a genetic predisposition that made them both vulnerable to this particular pathogen, Rebecca's immune system is mounting a more effective secondary response than her mother's did. Secondary response, Jessica echoed, struggling to follow the medical terminology. When our bodies encounter a pathogen, they create antibodies to fight it, Stone explained. If we encounter that same pathogen again, the response is typically faster and stronger. That's why vaccines work. What's puzzling is that Rebecca is showing signs of this enhanced secondary response, despite no documented prior exposure to this bacteria. Jessica frowned, trying to process this information. Could she have been exposed without knowing it? Maybe through David's aquarium before. Possibly, Stone conceded, but there's another explanation that fits the data better. She hesitated, then continued carefully. Anna Holmes was pregnant with Rebecca while conducting her initial research on coastal water samples. If she experienced a mild, unrecognized exposure during that time, Rebecca could have developed antibodies before she was even born. Jessica finished the implication dawning on her. So her mother's work might have actually protected her, in a way. It's a working theory, Stone acknowledged. We'd need more extensive testing to confirm it, but if correct, it suggests that Anna's research didn't just provide the treatment protocol. Her very exposure may have given Rebecca the immunological edge that's helping her survive. The connection across time and biology struck Jessica as both beautiful and terrible. Anna unknowingly passing to her daughter not just the genetic vulnerability to this pathogen, but also the beginnings of a defense against it. Does Rebecca know about this theory? Jessica asked. Stone shook her head. Not yet. I wanted to verify our findings first, but I think it might bring her some comfort, knowing that her mother's work, and perhaps even her illness, created a protection that's now saving Rebecca's life. Jessica nodded slowly, tears threatening again. A final gift from mother to daughter. Indeed, Stone agreed softly. Science rarely concerns itself with poetry, but occasionally it creates some anyway. When Rebecca next opened her eyes, the hospital room was bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. For a moment, she simply watched dust motes dancing in the sunbeams, her mind wonderfully, mercifully empty. Then awareness returned of where she was, of what had happened, of the bandaged remnants of her hands resting on pillows beside her. There she is, came a familiar voice. Rebecca turned her head to find Jessica sitting beside the bed. Dark circles under her eyes, but a genuine smile on her face. Hey, Rebecca managed, her voice hoarse. You look terrible. Jessica laughed, the sound brightening the sterile room. That's rich, coming from someone who's been at death's door. But thanks, I needed to hear that. How long have you been here? Pretty much since they admitted you, Jessica replied. Had to make sure these doctors were doing their job right. Rebecca attempted a smile, though it felt foreign on her face. Any news? No one will tell me anything concrete. Jessica leaned forward, her expression turning serious but hopeful. The treatment is working, Becca. The infection has stopped spreading. Dr. Stone says your blood work is showing significant improvement. A cautious relief bloomed in Rebecca's chest. Really, they're sure. As sure as doctors ever are, Jessica confirmed. Stone said they're cautiously optimistic, which I think is doctor speak for things are looking good, but we don't want to jinx it. Rebecca's gaze drifted to her bandaged hands. And these, what's the prognosis? Jessica's hesitation told Rebecca everything she needed to know. They're focusing on saving the tissue that remains, Jessica said carefully. Once the infection is fully under control, they'll start talking about reconstructive options. I saw them, Jess, Rebecca whispered. When they changed the bandages, they hardly look like hands anymore. Jessica reached out, gently touching Rebecca's arm above the bandages. I know, but medicine can do amazing things these days, and even if they can't restore everything, she paused, searching for the right words. You're more than your hands, Becca. You always have been. The simple truth of this statement struck Rebecca with unexpected force. For so long, she defined herself by what she could do, her research, her studies, her ability to work independently. The prospect of losing that self-definition was terrifying. Yet Jessica's words suggested another possibility. That perhaps her identity wasn't as tethered to physical capability as she'd always assumed. Dr. Stone has a theory about why you're responding to the treatment when your mother didn't. Jessica continued, clearly trying to steer the conversation toward more hopeful territory. She thinks you might have developed antibodies before you were even born, because your mother was exposed while she was pregnant with you. Really? Rebecca asked, genuinely intrigued despite her exhaustion. Yes, your mother's work, the very thing that eventually made her sick, might be what's saving you now, Jessica smiled sadly. Like she found a way to protect you even after she was gone. The poetic symmetry wasn't lost on Rebecca. Her mother's scientific legacy, preserved in meticulous notes and research papers, reaching across years to offer protection when Rebecca needed it most. There's something else, Jessica said, hesitation evident in her voice. Something Dr. Stone discovered in your mother's personal notes, separate from her official research. What is it? She knew Becca. Toward the end, when she was very sick, she suspected the connection between her research and her illness. Her last journal entry mentions concerns about specimens she'd collected from Tillamook Bay, the same location where David later gathered fish for your aquarium. Rebecca closed her eyes, the pieces falling into place with devastating clarity. A circle, she murmured. We've been moving in a circle this whole time. What do you mean? My mother studies a bacteria, becomes infected, and dies. David unknowingly collects the same bacteria, keeps it in our aquarium, then dies in an accident. I keep the tank as a memorial to him, allowing the bacteria to grow stronger. Then I finally decide to clean it, becoming infected with the same thing that killed my mother. Rebecca laughed bitterly. It's almost elegant in its cruelty. But the circle breaks with you, Jessica insisted. You're going to survive this, Becca. Your mother's research made sure of that. As the golden afternoon light began to fade, Rebecca found herself contemplating this unexpected gift. A mother's protection reaching through time, science creating a bridge between loss and survival. Perhaps the circle wasn't closing around her after all. Perhaps it was finally breaking open. 8 months later, Rebecca Holmes stood at the edge of Tillamook Bay, watching the spring tide roll in. The late May sunshine cast golden ripples across the water, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of salt and new growth. At her feet rested a small wooden box, hand-carved and sealed with beeswax, a container for memories and final goodbyes. She lifted her hands, examining them in the clear light. The rite was more mechanical than organic now. A complex arrangement of skin grafts, reconstructed tendons, and custom prosthetic components where bone and tissue had been too damaged to save. 3 fingers moved with reasonable dexterity. The others remained largely immobile despite months of intensive therapy. Her left hand had fared better, retaining most of its function, though bearing the roadmap of scars that told the story of her brush with death. Need any help with that? Jessica asked, approaching from where she'd parked the car. She gestured toward the wooden box but didn't move to take it, understanding Rebecca's need to do this herself. I've got it, Rebecca replied, her voice stronger than it had been in months. Just waiting for the right moment. Jessica nodded, standing beside her friend in companionable silence. The past 8 months had transformed them both, Rebecca through her struggle for recovery, Jessica through her unwavering presence during that journey. Their friendship had deepened into something that transcended ordinary bonds, forged in the crucible of near tragedy and daily triumphs. Rebecca glanced at her watch, a special design with a magnetic clasp she could manage with her limited dexterity. Almost time. The tide was coming in, water creeping higher along the rocky shore. This was the spot where Anna Holmes had collected her samples years ago, where David had later gathered specimens for their aquarium. The circle of connection, of loss and discovery, centered on this unremarkable stretch of Oregon coastline. "You sure you want to do this?" Jessica asked softly. "No one would blame you if you changed your mind." Rebecca smiled, the expression coming more naturally now than it had in the early days of her recovery. "I'm sure. It feels right." When the tide reached its peak, Rebecca carefully knelt at the water's edge. With deliberate movements, the product of countless hours of occupational therapy, she opened the wooden box to reveal its contents. A small portion of David's ashes, preserved after his funeral 3 years earlier. A weathered notebook that had belonged to her mother, and several photographs showing 3 generations of Holmes women at this very bay. "I held on to these things because I was afraid of forgetting," Rebecca said, not to Jessica, but to the sea itself. "I thought memories lived in objects, that letting go meant losing the people I loved all over again." She traced a finger along her mother's notebook, feeling the indentations where Anna's pen had pressed against paper, recording observations that would ultimately save her daughter's life. "But memories don't live in things," Rebecca continued. "They live in us, in what we learn, what we pass on, how we change." With careful movements, she removed the contents of the box one by one. First, she opened the notebook to its final pages, Anna's last research notes, written as she began to suspect the connection between her work and her illness. Rebecca tore these pages free, folded them into a paper boat as her mother had taught her to do as a child, and set it gently on the incoming tide. "Your work is done, Mom," she whispered as the small vessel bobbed on the waves. "You saved me. Now you can rest." Next came the photographs, which Rebecca tucked back into the box. These she would keep memories that brought joy rather than anchored her to grief. Finally, she lifted the small container of David's ashes, feeling the familiar weight in her reconstructed hand. "I kept your aquarium because I couldn't bear to say goodbye," she said softly. "I thought keeping it meant keeping part of you alive. But all I did was create a home for the very thing that nearly destroyed me." With a deep breath, Rebecca opened the container and scattered the ashes across the water's surface, watching as they dispersed among the waves. "Goodbye, David," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Thank you for the love we shared, for the passion you brought to everything, for teaching me that life is meant to be lived fully, even when it hurts." As the last of the ashes disappeared into the tide, Rebecca felt a weight lift from her shoulders, not the sudden release of a burden dropped, but the gentle lightening that comes with acceptance. The circle was complete, the connections honored, the lessons learned. "Well, I'll be," came a familiar voice from behind them. "If it isn't my favorite patient out conquering the world already." Rebecca turned to find Marja Renner making her way carefully down the rocky path, dressed not in hospital scrubs, but in casual clothes, her gray hair loose around her shoulders. "Marjo," Rebecca exclaimed in surprise, "what are you doing here?" "Your friend invited me," Marjo replied, nodding toward Jessica. "Said you were doing something important today and thought you might like some extra support." She approached, eyeing Rebecca's hands with a professional assessment. "How's the therapy coming along?" Better every day, Rebecca replied, demonstrating by carefully closing and opening her right hand. The movements were stiff but purposeful. Dr. Martinez says I've exceeded expectations. Of course you have, Marjo said with a satisfied nod. Knew you were a fighter from day one. She glanced at the wooden box, then at the water where David's ashes had disappeared. Saying your goodbyes. More like making peace, Rebecca clarified. With the past, with what happened, with who I am now. Marjo softened with understanding. Every storm runs out of rain, sweetheart. The sun always comes back. The three women stood together at the edge of the bay, watching as the tide reached its peak and began, imperceptibly at first, to recede. Life moving in its endless cycles of advance and retreat, of fullness and emptiness. So Jessica said eventually, breaking the contemplative silence, should we tell her the news? Rebecca smiled, anticipation brightening her expression. Might as well, she'll find out soon enough. Marjo looked between them, eyebrows raised. What news? I've been accepted back into the graduate program at the Marine Biology Institute, Rebecca announced. Starting this fall, with some accommodations for my hands. Of course you have, Marjo exclaimed. Though I can't say I'm surprised. You've got more determination than most folks I've met in all my years of nursing. There's more, Rebecca continued. I'll be working on a specific research project, studying the bacteria that infected me and my mother, developing better detection methods for coastal water monitoring. Turning your trauma into purpose, Marjo nodded approvingly. Best kind of healing there is. Dr. Stone is collaborating with us, Jessica added. She's as invested in this research as we are now. Well, that's just perfect, Marjo declared. Your mother started the work, and now you'll finish it. Things have a way of coming full circle when they're meant to. As they made their way back up the path, Rebecca paused for one last look at the bay. The water glistened in the late afternoon sun, beautiful and dangerous and essential, much like life itself. Her hands would never be the same, would never regain their former capability, but they would be enough. They would hold microscopes and test tubes, turn pages in textbooks, type slower but with greater purpose. And perhaps someday, hold the hands of others who needed guidance through their own darkness. The sea remembers, her mother had said in that fever dream months ago. It holds onto things we try to forget. But Rebecca was no longer trying to forget. She was remembering purposefully, gratefully, selectively, and moving forward, carrying with her only what served the journey ahead. Ready? Jessica asked, waiting at the top of the path. Rebecca nodded, turning away from the harbor with a light heart. Ready. As we age, we often find ourselves like Rebecca, clinging to remnants of what once was, afraid that letting go means losing those we've loved. We keep their clothes in closets, their voicemails on our phones, their tools in garages untouched. We create shrines to the past, not realizing these memorials sometimes prevent us from healing. Rebecca's journey reminds us that holding on too tightly to what we've lost can unknowingly harm us, while the wisdom to know when to release, like Marjo's gentle observation, that every storm runs out of rain, is the true gift of our years. The most precious legacy our loved ones leave isn't found in objects we can touch, but in how they've shaped our hearts and minds. Anna's research saved her daughter's life long after she was gone, not through the tangible notebook, but through the knowledge she documented and the protective antibodies she unknowingly passed on. As we enter life's autumn, perhaps our greatest challenge isn't preserving the past, but honoring it properly. By taking what serves us, releasing what doesn't, and using our experiences, even the painful ones, to create meaning that extends beyond our own lives. This is how we truly remember. This is how the circle remains unbroken. Thank you for spending this time with Brad Arrows. We hope the stories whispered through the rain carried you far into your imagination or your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know how you liked the journey. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and let the darkness comfort you.